The morning was cold enough that the air burned in the lungs. Frost held tight to the grass and shadowed places a thin crust of ice covering puddles along the lower trail. Silas Thornton had risen before first light the way he always did, and prepared himself for another day that would look much the same as the ones behind it. He was 45 years old, with a wiry build hardened by years of ranching and soldiering, and a face cut by lines that did not come only from sun. His beard was short, streaked with gray, though he was not yet an old man. His eyes were storm-gray, sharp and watchful, the kind that studied a place before stepping into it. Silas left his cabin with a rifle slung across his shoulder hat pulled low against the dawn chill. His boots cracked at the seams, but well-oiled crunched over the frost as he followed a faint trail into the timber. The rifle was not for show. He had been a scout during the war, and before that, a cattle hand driving long herds north, and he had learned what it meant to depend on the meat you could bring in. Venison, rabbit, or turkey, it didn't matter. A man living this far out couldn't rely on the town store. He'd lived near the New Mexico border long enough to know winters stretched lean. That was why he was out in the half-light of morning, focused on the task of putting food on his table. As he moved deeper into the pines, his mind drifted to how he had ended up here. He had once been Captain Silas Thornton, a respected officer in the Union Army during the war between the states. After the war, he had stayed on as a scout and tracker for the frontier cavalry. He had dreams. Once a wife in Missouri, a home, perhaps children. Elizabeth had been beautiful patient with his long absences and full of quiet strength. The fever had taken her in a matter of days. He buried her under an oak tree and walked away from the land they had shared because he couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. Then there was his last mission as a military scout. The memories came unbidden, sharp as a blade, the screams, the smoke, the feeling of utter helplessness as his commanding officer ordered the attack on a peaceful Apache village based on false intelligence. Silas had protested, had tried to stop it, but his words fell on deaf ears. By the time the sun rose the next morning, an entire community lay in ashes. They called it the Raven Ridge Massacre. He had resigned his commission the following day. Since then, he kept to himself, building a cabin in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and working enough land to stay alive. He spoke little, drank less, and went into Santa Fe early when he had to. People didn't ask much about him, and he didn't give them reason to. The trail ahead showed signs of wildlife, a deer print pressed into mud now frozen solid, the scattered remains of pine cones stripped by squirrels. Silas moved with practiced silence, tracking a buck he'd spotted days earlier. But as he crested a small rise, something else caught his eye. There, in a small clearing ahead, was a perfect circle drawn in the snow. The morning light cast long shadows across it, revealing strange markings that Silas recognized as Apache symbols, symbols for protection, for spirits, for passage to the next world. Around the edge of the circle, something dark stained the snow. Blood. Silas dropped to one knee, rifle-ready eyes scanning the tree line. This wasn't a hunting scene. This was something else entirely, a ceremony perhaps, or a ritual, and it had been interrupted. The blood was fresh, no more than a few hours old. He approached cautiously, decades of frontier instinct keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The circle was about 12 feet across, the symbols drawn with precision. In the center lay a bundle of what looked like cloth, half covered by fresh snow, except it wasn't cloth. A woman lay there dressed in a torn buckskin dress, her dark hair spread across the white ground. She was Apache, her skin the color of burnished copper, though now pale from cold and blood loss. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible in the cold air. Around her wrists were raw marks where ropes had cut into flesh, and dried blood caked the side of her face. As Silas knelt beside her, his hand automatically moved to check for a pulse. Her skin was cold, but a faint rhythm beat beneath his fingers. She was alive, but barely. Suddenly her eyes flew open, dark, fierce, and filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. They locked on him and held there. She didn't speak, didn't beg, didn't even try to move. She just stared at him, as if daring him to finish what others had started. And in that look, Silas felt something he hadn't in years. Recognition. Not of her face, but of that expression. He had seen it in the mirror every day after Raven Ridge. He glanced at her shoulder, where the buckskin had torn away. There, inked into her skin, was a tattoo he recognized immediately, an eagle with a rattlesnake clutched in its talons. It was the symbol of a particular Apache band, one that was supposed to have been completely wiped out at Raven Ridge. Old instincts tightened every muscle in his body. He had fought against Apache raiders, had lost friends to sudden attacks. The memory of it lived sharp in him, and for a moment, it was that memory that moved his hands toward the rifle. The woman's eyes followed his movement, unblinking. Then her cracked lips parted, and she whispered in Apache, a language he knew just enough of to understand, "Gagin Dan Sta." The black crows are coming. Silas froze the phrase, hitting him like a physical blow. Black crows was what the Apache called certain cavalry units that wore black hats. His old unit. But they weren't supposed to be anywhere near here, not anymore. The woman's eyes began to close, her strength fading. Silas made his decision in that moment. He slid his arms beneath her carefully and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, her frame strong, but wasted by whatever ordeal she had endured. Her body tensed in his arms, but she had no strength to resist. He rose to his feet, with her weight steady in his grip, and turned back toward the trail. Every step carried the weight of his choice. He thought of how she might see him as just another enemy, another white man who could hurt her. He thought of what it meant to bring an Apache woman into his cabin when tensions in the territory were already running high. He thought of the quiet cabin waiting for him and how it would not be the same once he crossed the threshold with her in his arms. Still, he walked. The frost crunched under his boots, the trees closed around him, and a raven called in the distance. Silas Thornton carried her out of the clearing, not knowing yet what it would cost him, only knowing he could not leave her to die in the snow By the time Silas reached the cabin, the sun had pushed higher through the trees, spilling narrow shafts of light across the clearing. His arms burned from the weight of the woman, though she was not heavy. The uneven trail and long carry had left him stiff. Smoke from his chimney hung light in the cold air, the fire inside still alive from the embers he had banked before leaving at dawn. He shifted her weight, careful not to jar her more than necessary, and kicked the door open with the side of his boot. The cabin was one large room, plain but solid, built from logs cut from the slope behind it. A narrow bed sat against one wall with a wool blanket and a single quilt folded at the foot. A table with 2 chairs stood near the window, worn from years of use. Shelves along the far side carried jars of beans, dried corn, a sack of flour, and a handful of tools. A Winchester leaned against the wall, its stock oiled and ready. Silas lowered the woman onto the bed. She shifted slightly, her eyes flicking around the cabin as if taking stock of it, the way a trapped animal studies a pen. He saw the way her chest rose too fast, the strain in her breath, and knew she was closer to the edge than he liked. He set the quilt over her, tucking it high enough to cover where her dress had torn. She watched him, eyes sharp with suspicion, but she did not pull away. Silas moved to the hearth, stoked the fire with a split log, and poured water from a kettle into a tin cup. Carrying it back, he crouched and held it out. Her hand rose slowly, trembling, her wrists raw from old ropes. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, and drank. Water spilled at the corner of her mouth, running down her chin, but she swallowed steadily, not wasting a drop. "You got a name?" Silas asked, his voice low, rasping from disuse. She looked at him long, her face unreadable. Then, in halting English, she said, "Ayita." He gave a short nod. "Silas." That was all. The silence sat heavy between them, filled by the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the kettle still warming. He stood and turned to the shelf, pulling down a tin of beans and a heel of bread left from the night before. He poured the beans into a small pan and set them over the fire. His stomach tightened at the thought of sharing supplies meant to last him through the next week, but he pushed it aside. Leaving her to die would have weighed heavier. When the beans were warm, he set the pan on the table and broke the bread in half. He carried it over to her, crouched again, and placed it within reach. She looked at the food, then at him. For a moment, she didn't move, suspicion still written in the tight line of her shoulders. Then hunger won. She ate carefully, chewing, slow swallowing with effort, as though every bite carried pain. He saw how thin she was beneath the torn dress, how her collarbones stood out sharp. "Been running long?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. She glanced at him, then away. "Chain," she said, finally, her voice low. She touched her wrist, where rope burns had darkened her skin, then her shoulder, where a deep bruise marred the copper. That single word said more than a long explanation. He understood enough. She had been held used, and somehow she had slipped free or been left behind when they thought she wouldn't last. His jaw worked as he stood again. He'd seen men do things in the war he still wished he could forget. He had no interest in adding his name to that list. While she ate, he pulled a small tin of salve from a shelf and a strip of clean cloth. Sitting at the edge of the bed, he reached for her arm. She tensed every muscle, ready to pull away. He stopped, hand hovering, waiting for her eyes to meet his. "Just to clean it," he said. His voice was flat, steady. Slowly, she let her arm relax. He dabbed the raw skin on her wrist, wrapped it with cloth, and tied it off. She flinched once, sharp, but did not resist. He worked the same on her other wrist, then pulled back, putting the tin away. The morning stretched. He moved through his usual tasks, checking the rifle, splitting another log, stacking wood inside, while she stayed on the bed, watching him. He felt her gaze, but did not look back often. He knew what she saw, a man alone, too long scarred from things he rarely spoke of. What he saw when he did glance her way was a woman who had survived worse than most men could imagine. Questions pressed at him. Who had left her there? How close were they? Would they come looking? He weighed the risk against the choice he had already made. He could not take it back now. By midday, she had fallen asleep under the quilt, her face turned toward the fire. He sat at the table with a whetstone running the edge of his knife across it, slow and methodical, his eyes drifting toward her every so often. He had not planned for any of this. He had left that morning thinking only of meat for his table. Instead, he had brought back a stranger who carried danger with her, but also something else, something he had not felt in years. The cabin, usually so still, no longer felt empty. As dusk approached, Silas lit the oil lamp and hung it from the ceiling hook. The soft yellow glow cast long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, and he could hear the wind picking up, rattling the shutters. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when he noticed an envelope that had been slipped under his door. It must have been delivered while he was hunting. Frowning, he picked it up, turning it over in his weathered hands. It bore the seal of the Santa Fe Town Council. Inside was a letter written in formal language requesting that Silas consider selling his land to the Western Union Railroad Company, which was planning a new line through the territory. The offer was generous, more money than he had seen in years. There was also a warning, subtle but clear: "We hope you will see the benefits this arrangement would bring to all parties involved, as the alternative methods of acquisition would be regrettable." Attached was a map marking his cabin and a large area surrounding it. Something about the marked area struck him as odd. It extended far beyond what would be needed for railroad tracks, encompassing a section of hills to the north that were of little use for anything. Hills that, according to old stories, contained hidden Apache treasures. Silas folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, his mind working. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to buy his land, but it was the first time the request had come with a veiled threat. When he turned back to check on Aita, he found her awake, watching him. There was a different quality to her gaze now, less fearful, more calculating. "Paper," she said, nodding toward his pocket. "Nothing important," he replied, moving to stir the stew he had left simmering over the fire. As he ladled some into a bowl for her, she surprised him by pushing herself upright. Her movements were stiff, pained, but determined. He brought the food to her, and this time she didn't hesitate before eating. While she ate, Silas noticed something he had missed before. The edge of her dress was not merely torn, it had been deliberately cut to remove something. A thin thread hung loose where a piece had been separated. He said nothing, but filed the observation away. Night fell completely, the darkness outside absolute. In the mountains, night brought a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Silas had grown accustomed to it over the years, had even come to find comfort in it. But tonight, the silence felt different. "Why help?" Aita asked suddenly, her voice stronger than before. Silas looked at her, considering his answer. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Finally he said, "Didn't want to see you die out there." She studied him long, as if weighing the truth of his words. "You soldier," she said, not a question but a statement. He tensed. "Once, not anymore." "I see soldier eyes," she continued, touching her own face near her eyes. "See many things, bad things." Silas didn't respond, but he felt exposed, as if she had somehow read the memories he carried. "You sleep," he said, finally standing to bank the fire for the night. "I'll take the floor." He made a simple bed near the hearth, rolling out a blanket and using his saddle as a pillow. It wasn't the first time he'd slept on a hard floor, and it wouldn't be the last. Before settling down, he checked that both rifles were loaded and within reach. As he was about to extinguish the lamp, Aita spoke again, her voice drifting from the darkness of the bed. "Black crows coming. Not for me only." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Silas turned the lamp down until the flame died, leaving only the red glow of embers to light the room. "We'll deal with that tomorrow," he said, though he knew sleep would be a long time coming. The next morning, Silas woke to find Aita already awake, sitting up in bed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked better, some color returned to her face, though the bruises stood out stark against her skin. Outside, snow was falling, thick flakes drifting past the window. It would be a day for indoor work, for repairs and planning. Silas built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. "Need to look at your other injuries," he said, not looking directly at her. "If that's all right." She gave a small nod. He brought the tin of salve and fresh bandages, then hesitated. "You're back. Need to see it." Understanding crossed her face. She turned slightly, presenting her back to him, and carefully pulled the torn dress down just enough to reveal a long gash that ran across her shoulder blade. It was partially scabbed over, but still angry-looking. As Silas cleaned the wound, he noticed something beneath the injury, a scar old and faded round like a bullet wound. Something about its placement sparked a memory, but he couldn't place it. He focused on his task, cleaning and binding the fresh wound, trying not to think about how the old scar had gotten there. When he finished, she pulled her dress back up and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, the words careful, as if she had practiced them. Silas nodded, putting the supplies away. "You should rest more. I'll get you something better to wear later." He spent the morning making repairs to tools and mending a shirt that had torn along one seam. Aida watched him work, her eyes tracking every movement. The silence between them was less tense now, but still heavy with unasked questions. After a simple lunch of cornbread and jerky, Silas decided to address what had been on his mind since finding her. "That circle in the snow," he began. "What was it?" Aida's expression closed instantly. "Sacred." "I know Apache weighs some," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Was it a healing circle or something else?" She studied him clearly, deciding how much to share. "Circle for spirits, to send them home." She gestured vaguely toward the sky. "When land is taken, must send spirits first, or they lost forever." Silas thought about this. What land? Sacred land, where ancestors sleep. She looked toward the window, toward the hills beyond. Land where railroad wants to go. The pieces began to click into place. The map, the railroad, the urgency of the town council's letter. They weren't just building a railroad line, they were planning to cut through Apache burial grounds. "Who stopped you during the ceremony?" Aida's eyes darkened. "Men who took me before. Leader with blue eyes." She touched her wrist where the rope burns were healing. "He wants old treasure. Thinks I know where. Do you?" She met his gaze directly. "No treasure like white men think. Sacred places only. But they not believe." Silas nodded slowly. He had heard the tales of Apache gold hidden in the hills of ancient artifacts worth a fortune. Most were just that, stories. But some men would kill on far less. "These men," he said, "the ones who held you. They military." Aida shook her head. "Not now. Before, yes. Now they work for railroad." She paused, searching for words. "Leader was colonel, now wears black coat, fine hat." Something cold settled in Silas's gut. There weren't many colonels who had operated in this territory, and fewer still who would now be working for the railroad. "This colonel," he said carefully, "he have a name, Reed." She said the name coming out like a curse. "Colonel Reed." Silas felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. Montgomery Reed had been his commanding officer at Raven Ridge. The man who had ordered the massacre despite Silas's protests that the intelligence was wrong. The man who had built his reputation on pacifying the Apache territory. And now he was here working for the railroad, looking for something in the hills. Something Aida was supposed to know about. Silas stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the falling snow. His mind raced. If Reed was in the area, it was only a matter of time before he came looking for Aida. And if he found her here with Silas. "You know this man," Aida said, not a question. Silas didn't turn. "Yes, he is why you not soldier anymore." He turned, then surprised. Her perception was uncanny. "Something like that," he admitted. Aida nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "Then we both run from same man." The day wore on, the snow continuing to fall, blanketing the world outside in white silence. Silas found an old shirt of his for Aita to wear, and she changed behind a blanket he hung for privacy. When she emerged, the shirt hung loose on her frame, but it was whole, not torn like her dress. As dusk approached again, Silas noticed her examining something small in her hands. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. It was a piece of her dress cut away and hidden. On it was a small piece of hide, tanned and folded. She quickly closed her hand around it when she noticed him looking. "Important?" he asked. She hesitated, then slowly opened her hand. "Map," she said. "Not to treasure, to sacred place. I take from Reed's tent when I escape." Silas looked at the small piece of hide. It was marked with symbols he didn't recognize, lines that might represent ridges or valleys. It seemed useless without context, but clearly Reed thought it valuable. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she placed it in his palm. As he unfolded it fully, he noticed something on the back, a seal stamped into the hide. A military seal. His old regiment. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. "From Reed's things. He not know I take." Silas turned the hide over, studying the seal more closely. Below it, barely visible, were the words Raven Ridge Operation and a date, the date of the massacre. "What does it say?" Aita asked, watching his face. Silas hesitated. "It's a military mark, from an operation 10 years ago." Her eyes never left his face. "Raven Ridge," she said softly. He looked up sharply. "You know that name. I know all names of places where my people died." Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a deep pain. "Raven Ridge is where my mother died. Where all died, except me and few others." The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. "You were there." She nodded once. "I was young, hiding when soldiers came. Saw everything." Her hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder, to the old scar he had noticed earlier. "One bullet find me, but I live." Silas felt sick. The old scar on her shoulder. The position matched exactly where he had fired at a fleeing figure during the chaos of the attack. A shot he had taken not to kill, but to stop someone from running directly into the line of fire of the other soldiers. He had always told himself the person had escaped, that his warning shot had saved them from worse. Now, looking at Aita, he wasn't so sure. "The soldier who shot me," she continued, watching him closely. "He different from others. He try to stop them first. Then, when not stop, he shoot some of us, but not to kill. To make us fall, stay down until killing done." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "I think maybe he saved some of us. I never forget his face." Silas couldn't speak. The weight of possibility pressed down on him. Could she recognize him after all these years? He had worn a full beard, then had been younger, less weathered. But the eyes didn't change. "Rest now," he said roughly, standing and moving away. "We'll talk more tomorrow." That night, as snow continued to fall outside, Silas lay awake on his makeshift bed, staring at the ceiling. Across the room, Aita's breathing was even peaceful in sleep. But for Silas, peace was a distant memory. If Reed was hunting for Apache treasure using an old military map, and if Aita had stolen part of that map, it was only a matter of time before he came looking. And when he did, he would find not only Aita, but also the scout, who had resigned in protest after Raven Ridge. Two loose ends from a past Montgomery Reed would rather keep buried. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, the snow piling high around the cabin. Silas spent the morning clearing a path to the small stable where he kept his horse and bringing in more firewood. The cold was bitter, the kind that found its way through layers of wool and leather to settle in the bones. When he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots, he found Aida sitting at the table, a mug of coffee steaming in front of her. She had managed to dress herself in the clothes he had provided, his old shirt tucked into her skirt, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders for warmth. "You have map piece too," she said without preamble, her dark eyes steady on his face. Silas paused in the act of hanging his coat. "What makes you say that?" "I see you look at my piece. You know what it is. You have seen before." He considered denying it, but something in her direct gaze made him reconsider. He moved to a trunk in the corner and unlocked it with a key he kept on a cord around his neck. From inside, he withdrew a small oilskin packet. Returning to the table, he unfolded the oilskin to reveal a piece of hide similar to the one Aida had shown him. It was marked with the same strange symbols, but showing a different section of whatever it mapped. "I took this from Reed's tent," he admitted. "The night after Raven Ridge, I wanted proof of what really happened, that the orders were based on lies." Aida reached out her fingers, hovering over the hide without touching it. "You know what this is?" "I thought it was evidence," he said. "Proof that the attack wasn't about hostile Apache at all, but about something else. But I could never make sense of it." She nodded slowly. "Because it not complete. Many pieces. Some with my people, some with Reed, some lost." "What is it a map of exactly?" She hesitated, then said sacred places, where ancestors' spirits live, where ceremonies must happen when seasons change. She gestured toward his piece, this show path to prayer circle, place where young become warriors. Silas studied the markings with new understanding. Not a treasure map, as Reed believed, but something far more valuable to the Apache, a spiritual map of their sacred lands. "And Reed thinks it leads to gold. White men always think our sacred things are about gold," she said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "They not understand." Silas refolded his piece of the map and returned it to the oilskin. "Why does Reed think you know where this treasure is?" "Because my father was keeper of ceremonies," she said. "Before Raven Ridge, he teach me some ways. Reed think I know all secrets." She looked away. "But many secrets die with elders that day." Silas felt the weight of this revelation. "So you were performing a ceremony when I found you in the snow?" She nodded. "Last ceremony before railroad comes, to send spirits to new home." She looked toward the window, toward the snow-covered hills beyond. "But I not finish. Spirits still waiting." They sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling between them. Finally Silas spoke. "What happens if the ceremony isn't completed?" "Spirits have no peace. They walk forever." She met his eyes. "Like you. Like me." The words struck deeper than she could know. Silas had been walking without peace since Raven Ridge, carrying the weight of what he had failed to prevent. "The railroad's coming through no matter what," he said finally. "Those hills will be dug up, tracks laid." "I know," she said simply. "Cannot stop Iron Horse, but can give spirits peace first." Silas nodded slowly, understanding. It wasn't about stopping progress or fighting a battle they couldn't win. It was about doing what was right while there was still time. "If Reed finds you trying to complete the ceremony again, he'll take you, or worse." "Yes," she agreed, "but I must try." Silas stood, moved to the fireplace, and stared into the flames. The choice before him was clear, though the path was not. He could turn Aita out, wash his hands of the whole affair. He could even take the railroad's offer and leave this place behind. Or he could help her finish what she had started, knowing it would likely bring Reed's men down on them both. "When the snow stops," he said finally, not turning from the fire, "I'll help you complete your ceremony." He heard her soft intake of breath. "Why?" she asked. Silas turned then, meeting her eyes across the room. "Because I couldn't stop what happened at Raven Ridge. But maybe I can do this one thing right." She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single nod of acceptance. No gratitude, no effusive thanks, just acknowledgement of a debt that might finally be repaid. Outside, the snow began to taper off, the storm moving east. By morning, they would be able to reach the sacred circle. And after that, whatever came would come. As evening drew in, Silas prepared a simple meal of stew and cornbread. They ate in companionable silence, the earlier tension eased by their new understanding. After cleaning the dishes, Silas sat in his chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine, while Aita watched. "You alone, long time," she observed, breaking the quiet. He glanced up. "Yes." "Wife?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the single photograph on the shelf, a faded image of a woman with kind eyes. "Died long ago." She nodded, accepting this without pressing. "My people, too. All gone." The silence that followed wasn't empty, but full of shared understanding. Two survivors carrying their dead with them. As the fire burned low, Aita surprised him by beginning to hum softly. The melody was haunting, rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. Without thinking, Silas stopped his whittling to listen. Noticing his attention, she spoke. "Song of the Eagle," she explained. "Story of great bird who carries souls of dead to spirit world." She gestured to the tattoo on her shoulder, visible where the shirt hung loose. "Eagle with snake, symbol of my band. Eagle who carries snake, who guards." Silas listened as she continued, the melody filling the cabin. It was the first time he had heard music there since he couldn't remember when. The song spoke of flight, of freedom, of release from earthly bonds. Though he couldn't understand the Apache words, the meaning seemed to transcend language. When she finished, the silence that followed felt deeper, somehow sanctified by the music that had filled it moments before. "Beautiful," he said simply. "Song for those with no home," she replied. "No eagle for me now." "What do you mean?" She touched her tattoo again. "Eagle carries lost souls home. But I have no home, no people to return to." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Silas understood them better than she knew. He too had no home to return to, no people waiting. "There's a saying among soldiers," he said after a moment. "Home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's just knowing you've done right by those who count on you." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "Wise words." "Not mine," he admitted. "My father's, before he died at Gettysburg. You fight in big war with blue and gray. Yes, Union side, blue." She studied him. "You fight for freedom, for black men in chains." The question surprised him. Few out here framed the war that way anymore, especially not 10 years later. "Partly," he said honestly. "Mostly I fought because it seemed right at the time, to keep the country whole." "And then you fight Indians who want to keep their land whole." She observed no accusation in her voice, just a stating of facts. Silas couldn't argue with the truth of it. "I was following orders," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "Until Raven Ridge. Then I couldn't anymore." She nodded, accepting this. Tomorrow we finish ceremony, she said, changing the subject. Then spirits free, whatever comes after. Whatever comes, he agreed. As they prepared for sleep, Silas noticed Aita shivering despite the fire's warmth. The cabin grew cold at night, especially this high in the mountains during winter. Without comment, he took his heaviest blanket and brought it to her bed. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Extra warmth." She took it, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. As he turned to go back to his bedroll by the fire, she caught his wrist lightly. He looked back surprised. "You were there," she said, her eyes holding his. "At Raven Ridge. You were the soldier who shot to save, not to kill." Silas felt his breath catch. "How can you be sure? Eyes don't change," she said simply. "Even after 10 winters." He didn't confirm or deny, but something in his expression must have given him away. "I hated you long time," she continued, "for not stopping it all, for being part of it." She released his wrist. "But then I understand. One man cannot stop river, can only try to pull few from water." With that, she turned away, pulling the blankets up around her. Silas stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him. Then, silently, he returned to his bedroll and lay down. Sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept returning to Raven Ridge, to the chaos and smoke and screams, to the moment he realized his commander had led them into not a hostile camp, but a peaceful village, to his futile attempts to stop the slaughter, and to the shot he had fired at a fleeing figure, a girl he now knew, intending to bring her down before the other soldiers saw her running. He had told himself for years that his actions had saved lives that day, that by bringing some down with warning shots rather than killing shots, he had allowed them to survive when the massacre was done. It had been the thin thread he clung to, the only justification he could find for his part in the day's horror. And now, by some twist of fate, that same girl lay in his bed 10 years later. She had recognized him, had carried the mark of his bullet all this time. And somehow, impossibly, she had found it in herself not to hate him for it. He turned his face toward the dying embers of the fire. Tomorrow they would attempt to complete Aita's ceremony to send the spirits of her people to their rest. And after that, they would face whatever came, together. For the first time in years, Silas Thornton fell asleep with something like peace in his heart. Dawn brought clear skies and bitter cold. The snow had stopped, but it lay deep across the clearing, pristine and untouched in the early light. Silas rose before first light, as was his habit, and built up the fire. He put coffee on to boil and checked his rifles, making sure both were cleaned and loaded. Aita woke as he was preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with dried berries. She sat up, her hair loose around her shoulders, the blankets pulled close against the morning chill. "Today," she said, no question in her voice. "Today," he agreed. "If you're strong enough." She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, testing her strength. "I am ready." After they had eaten, Silas brought out warmer clothes for her, a heavy wool shirt that had shrunk in washing, a pair of woolen socks, and his spare coat. It was too large for her, but it would keep the worst of the cold at bay. "You'll need these," he said, holding them out. She took them with a nod of thanks and disappeared behind the privacy blanket to dress. When she emerged, she looked stronger, more substantial, though the coat hung comically large on her frame. Silas had been thinking about their route. The circle where he had found Aita was a good 2-hour walk through deep snow, and he was concerned about her stamina after her ordeal. He opted for a different plan. "We'll take the horse," he said. "I can lead him through the trees. It'll be faster, and you won't have to walk in the snow." She considered this, then nodded agreement. "But must approach circle on foot," she added. "Last part is sacred way." "Of course." Silas packed a small bag with essentials, extra ammunition, bandages, jerky, and a canteen of water. He hesitated, then added his map piece, carefully wrapped in its oilskin. Something told him they might need it. Aita watched his preparations, her expression solemn. From a hidden fold in her dress, she withdrew her own map fragment, now wrapped in a piece of cloth. She tucked it into an inner pocket of the coat. They left the cabin as the sun was just beginning to crest the eastern mountains. Silas led his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Cooper, from the small stable. He brushed the snow from the saddle and helped Aita mount, making sure she was secure before handing her the reins. "You've ridden before?" he asked. "Yes," she said, adjusting her position with the confidence of experience. "My father taught me." Silas nodded, satisfied, and began leading the horse through the snow toward the trees. He had his rifle slung across his back, a pistol at his hip, and a hunting knife in his boot. He hadn't prepared for a fight this way in years, but old habits returned easily. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch and the soft crunch of hooves in snow. Silas kept a careful watch alert for any sign they were not alone. But the world seemed empty, the cold having driven most creatures into hiding. After about an hour, they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Silas paused, studying the terrain. From here, he could see the clearing where he had found Aita, a small, dark circle in the expanse of white. But something wasn't right. Fresh tracks cut across the snow heading toward the circle. "Someone's been there," he said, pointing. "Recently." Aita leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gesture. "Reed's men," she said, her voice tight with certainty. "Likely," Silas agreed. "But they're gone now. Tracks lead away to the east." She nodded, but her posture remained tense. "They will return." "Probably, but we'll be done by then." He studied the area again. "We'll approach from the north, less exposed." They continued, taking a more circuitous route that kept them under the cover of trees as much as possible. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the snow with blinding brightness. Despite the cold, Silas found himself sweating from the exertion of breaking trail. About a half-mile from the circle, he stopped. "We'll go on foot from here," he said. "Less chance of being spotted." He helped Aita down from the horse and tied Cooper to a sturdy pine. The horse would be fine for a few hours, and having him here meant they could make a faster escape if necessary. Aita reached into her coat and withdrew a small pouch, which she hung around her neck. "Sacred items," she explained. "For ceremony." Silas nodded, not questioning. He checked his weapons one last time, then led the way through the trees, moving as quietly as the snow would allow. Aita followed close behind her, breathing steady, despite the difficult terrain. As they neared the clearing, Silas slowed, scanning carefully for any sign of watchers. The tracks he had seen earlier were the only disturbance in the snow, and they led away from the area. Still, caution had kept him alive this long. "Wait here," he whispered to Aita. "Let me check first." She nodded, pressing herself against a tree trunk for concealment, while he moved forward alone. Silas approached the edge of the clearing, slowly staying within the tree line, his eyes constantly moving. The circle was as he had left it, though partially filled with fresh snow. In the center, a dark stain still marked where Aita had lain. Satisfied they were alone, he signaled for her to join him. She moved quickly despite the deep snow, her focus entirely on the circle ahead. "How long will this take?" he asked as she reached his side. "Not long. Sun is right now." She pointed to the sky where the sun had reached its zenith. "Midday is when barrier between worlds is thinnest." Gillis nodded. "I'll keep watch. You do what you need to." She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of gratitude, then stepped out of the trees and into the clearing. Silas stayed at the edge, his rifle-ready eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. Aita moved to the center of the circle, her steps deliberate, following a pattern he couldn't discern. When she reached the middle, she knelt in the snow and began to sing softly the same melody she had sung in the cabin the night before. From her pouch, she removed several small items, a feather, what looked like a piece of bone, and some dried herbs. She arranged these in a pattern on the snow, still singing. Then she withdrew both map fragments and placed them side by side, completing part of the strange design. Silas watched fascinated despite his vigilance. The ceremony was unlike anything he had witnessed before. Yet there was something familiar in its reverence, in its connection to something beyond the visible world. The singing grew louder, more insistent. Aita raised her arms to the sky. Her face lifted her voice, carrying across the snow-covered clearing. The words were Apache, unintelligible to Silas, but the emotion behind them transcended language, grief, release, hope. As she sang, a breeze sprang up, stirring the snow around the circle despite the still air beyond. Silas blinked, wondering if he was imagining it. But no, there was definitely a small whirlwind forming around Aita, picking up loose snow and swirling it upward. For a moment, just a moment, Silas thought he saw shapes in the swirling snow faces, figures moving upward with the spiraling wind. Then the breeze died as suddenly as it had begun, and the snow settled back into stillness. Aita lowered her arms, her song fading to silence. She remained kneeling for a long moment, head bowed, before carefully retrieving the items she had placed on the snow, including both map fragments. She rose and turned toward Silas, her face peaceful, despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. "It is done," she said simply. "Spirits are free." Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, one he hadn't known he was carrying. "Good," he said. "Now, let's get out of here before—" The crack of a rifle shot cut through the air, the bullet kicking up snow just feet from where Aita stood. She dropped instinctively, rolling toward the tree line, as Silas brought his rifle up, searching for the source. "There," he called, spotting movement among the trees to the east. "Run!" Aita sprinted toward him as another shot rang out, this one closer. Silas fired in the direction of the shooter, not aiming to hit, but to provide cover. As soon as Aita reached the trees, he grabbed her arm and pulled her deeper into the forest. "To the horse," he said, keeping his voice low. "Quick and quiet." They moved as rapidly as the deep snow would allow, using trees for cover, changing direction frequently. Behind them, voices called out, but they were growing fainter. Their pursuers had lost sight of them in the dense forest. When they reached Cooper, Silas helped Aita up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. He urged the horse forward, keeping to the trees, avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted. "Were they Reed's men?" Aita asked, her voice steady, despite their narrow escape. "Most likely," Silas replied. "They must have been watching the circle, waiting for you to return. They know what I was doing." "Maybe not exactly, but they knew you'd come back there." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Ceremony complete. Spirits safe now." "And what about you?" She turned slightly to look at him. "I will live or die, but I am free now too." They rode in silence after that, taking a roundabout way back to the cabin. Silas kept them in the trees as much as possible, alert for any sign of pursuit. But the forest remained quiet, the only sounds their own passage, and the occasional call of a winter bird. It was mid-afternoon when they finally approached the cabin. Silas reined in Cooper at the edge of the trees, studying the clearing carefully before proceeding. Something felt wrong. Then he saw it, a thin wisp of smoke rising from his chimney. "Someone's inside," he whispered, drawing his pistol. Aita tensed in front of him. "Reed, don't know, wait here with Cooper." He slid from the saddle, handing her the reins. "If you hear shooting, ride east along the creek. Follow it down to the valley. There's a Navajo settlement about 20 miles downriver. They'll help you." She gripped his arm. "No, we face together." Silas hesitated, then nodded. "Stay behind me, then. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understand?" She released his arm, her eyes determined. "Understand." They left the horse tied in the trees and approached the cabin on foot, moving from cover to cover. Silas kept his pistol ready, his movements fluid with the practice of years in hostile territory. Aita followed silently, a natural stealth in her steps. As they neared the cabin, the door swung open. Silas raised his pistol, then froze at the sight of the man who stepped onto the porch. He was tall and straight-backed, despite his age, with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a black coat over a fine suit and a wide-brimmed black hat that shadowed his features. But Silas would have known him anywhere, Colonel Montgomery Reed. Behind him emerged two more men, both wearing the practical clothes of frontiersmen, but carrying military-issue rifles. They flanked Reed, their eyes scanning the clearing. "Thornton," Reed called his voice, carrying in the cold air. "I know you're out there. No need for unpleasantness. I just want to talk." Silas felt Aita's hand on his arm, her grip tight. He glanced at her and saw naked fear in her eyes for the first time since he'd found her. "It's all right," he whispered. "I won't let him take you." She shook her head. "Not me, I fear for," she whispered back. "You. He kill you and say was accident. Like others." Silas considered this. Reed had indeed developed a reputation for convenient accidents, befalling those who opposed him. "Thornton," Reed called again. "Don't make this difficult. I have men in the trees. You're surrounded." Silas doubted that was true. Reed had always been one for bluffs, but he couldn't be certain. He looked around, assessing their options. They could try to reach the horse and make a run for it, but in the open snow, they'd be easy targets. "What do you want, Reed?" he called finally, staying hidden behind a large pine. A smile spread across the colonel's face. "Ah, there you are. Just a friendly conversation, Captain, about old times and new opportunities." "I'm not a captain anymore. Haven't been for 10 years. "Details," Reed said dismissively. "Why don't you come out so we can talk like civilized men? Why don't you get off my property?" Reed's smile thinned. "Because you have something that belongs to me, or rather, someone." His eyes scanned the trees. "The Apache girl. I know she's with you. My men saw you both at the sacred circle." Silas exchanged a glance with Aita. She had gone still, her face a mask. "What do you want with her?" Silas called. "That's between her and me," Reed replied. "A business matter, you might say. The kind of business that leaves rope burns and bruises." Reed's expression hardened. "The girl is a thief and a liar. She stole something valuable from me. I want it back." "The map fragment," Silas said, his voice pitched low, so only Aita could hear. She nodded slightly. "What if she doesn't have what you're looking for?" Silas called to Reed. "Oh, she has it, or at least she knows where it is." Reed stepped forward, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. "And so do you, I suspect. You always were too curious for your own good, Thornton. It's what made you a good scout and a troublesome officer." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Reed knew or suspected that he had the other map fragment. which meant this was not just about Aita anymore. "Last chance, Thornton," Reed called. "Come out, bring the girl, and we'll discuss this reasonably, or my men will start shooting, and we'll sort through whatever's left afterward." Silas looked at Aita. "When I move, run for the back of the cabin," he whispered. "There's a cellar door on the far side. Hide there." "What will you do?" she whispered back. "Create a distraction." He checked his pistol, then his rifle. "Go on my signal." She nodded her eyes, never leaving his face. Silas took a deep breath, mentally plotting his route. Then, in one fluid motion, he stepped out from behind the tree and fired 2 rapid shots, not at Reed or his men, but at the lantern hanging from the porch roof. The glass shattered, kerosene spilling and igniting instantly. Flames leapt up the side of the cabin, creating a wall of fire and smoke. In the chaos, Silas darted to another tree as Reed's men opened fire, their shots going wide. "Now!" he called to Aita. She sprinted across the open ground, keeping low as Silas provided covering fire. He saw her disappear around the side of the cabin, hopefully to the cellar door. Reed was shouting orders, his men scrambling for better positions. The fire was spreading rapidly along the dry wood of the porch. It would engulf the cabin soon, if not checked. Silas used the confusion to make his way closer to the stable. If he could reach his second horse and draw Reed's men away, Aita might have a chance to escape in the other direction. He had almost reached the stable when a shot rang out from much closer than expected. Pain lanced through his arm, the bullet grazing his bicep. He spun, firing back instinctively, and saw one of Reed's men fall. The other was taking aim, but Silas was faster. His shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. That left Reed. Silas scanned the area but couldn't locate the colonel. Then he heard a shout from the direction of the cabin, Aita's voice raised in alarm. Heart pounding, Silas ran toward the sound, rounding the corner of the burning building, to see Reed dragging Aita from the cellar door, his pistol pressed to her head. "Drop the gun, Thornton!" Reed shouted when he saw Silas, "or I'll put a bullet in her brain." Silas froze, his rifle half raised. Aita's eyes met his, wide but determined. There was blood on her face where Reed had struck her. "Let her go, Reed," Silas said, his voice deadly calm. "This isn't about her." "Oh, but it is," Reed replied, his smile cold. "It's about her and her people's so-called sacred places, and the gold that's buried there. Gold that's going to make me a very rich man once the railroad goes through." "There is no gold," Silas said. "Just burial grounds, sacred sites." Reed laughed, a harsh sound. "Is that what she told you? And you believed her?" He shook his head. "You always were soft on the natives, Thornton. It's why you never advanced beyond captain, despite your talents." "There is no gold," Silas repeated. "Just land. Land that belongs to her people." "Her people are dead," Reed spat. "Thanks to us? Or have you forgotten Raven Ridge?" "I haven't forgotten a thing about Raven Ridge," Silas said, his voice tight. "Including the fact that you falsified intelligence to justify attacking a peaceful village." Reed's face darkened. "Careful, Thornton. That kind of talk could be considered treasonous." "It's not treason to tell the truth." "The truth," Reed sneered, "is whatever those in power say it is. And around here, that's me." He pressed the gun harder against Aita's temple. "Now drop your weapon, or I'll show you just how powerless you really are." Silas hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't risk Aita's life, but he had no doubt Reed would kill them both once he had what he wanted. Before he could decide, Aita moved. In a swift motion born of desperation, she drove her elbow back into Reed's stomach, twisting away from the gun. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet going wide as Reed staggered back. Silas raised his rifle, but Aita was still too close to Reed for a clear shot. She was struggling with the colonel, fighting with a ferocity born of years of hatred. Reed was stronger, but Aita was quicker, darting in and out of his reach. "Run!" Inela shouted to her. "Get clear!" She tried to break away, but Reed caught her by the hair, yanking her back. His face was contorted with rage as he raised his pistol again. Silas didn't hesitate. He fired the rifle's report, echoing across the clearing. Reed jerked backward, a look of surprise crossing his face as the bullet found its mark. He released. Aita staggered 2 steps and collapsed into the snow. For a moment, everything was still, except for the crackling of the fire consuming the cabin. Then Aita moved, scrambling away from Reed's motionless form. Silas approached cautiously, his rifle still trained on the colonel. But there was no need for caution. Montgomery Reed stared sightlessly at the winter sky, a bloom of red staining the snow beneath him. "Are you hurt?" Silas asked Aita, not taking his eyes off Reed. "No," she said, her voice shaky. Just a graze." He finally looked at her, relief washing over him at the sight of her standing whole and alive. "We need to go, now. The fire will be seen for miles." She nodded, but her eyes went to the burning cabin. "Your home." "Just wood," he said. "Can build another." He looked at the cellar door, still open. "Is there anything we can salvage quickly?" "I took these," she said, opening her coat to reveal a small bundle, his photograph of Elizabeth, a pouch of ammunition, and a few other small essentials she had managed to grab. Something tightened in Silas's chest at the sight of the photograph. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. They hurried to where Cooper was still tied, the horse nervous from the gunfire, but steady. Silas helped Aita mount, then swung up behind her, ignoring the pain in his wounded arm. As they rode away from the burning cabin, Silas looked back once. The home he had built with his own hands was engulfed in flames, Reed's body a dark shape in the snow beside it. It was the end of one chapter of his life, that much was certain. What would come next, he didn't know. But as he felt Aita's weight against him, solid and real, he realized he wasn't facing it alone anymore. They rode east along the creek, just as he had instructed her earlier. The Navajo settlement would be a safe place for now. After that, they would decide what came next. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Silas thought about the ceremony Aita had completed, sending spirits home, she had called it, giving peace to those who had none. He wondered if in some small way he had found a measure of that peace himself today, not through ceremony or song, but through a single choice to stand with someone who needed him, to finally, after 10 long years, do something right. Behind them, the glow of the burning cabin faded into the gathering darkness. Ahead, the path was unknown, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas Thornton rode toward it with hope. The sun was setting by the time Silas and Aita reached the bank of the frozen creek. They had ridden hard for nearly 2 hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the burning cabin. Cooper was breathing heavily, steam rising from his flanks in the cold air. They needed to rest him soon, or risk losing their only means of transportation. Silas reined in beneath the shelter of a cluster of pines. The branches sagged under the weight of snow, creating a natural windbreak. He slid from the saddle, wincing as the movement jarred his wounded arm, then helped Aita down. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, his breath fogging in the cold. "Horse needs rest, so do we." Aita nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. The day's events, completing the ceremony, the firefight with Reed, the desperate escape, had drained her. But her eyes remained alert, scanning the darkening forest around them. "Reed's men will follow," she said, her voice low. "Maybe," Silas agreed, "but not tonight, not in the dark with a storm coming." He glanced at the western sky, where heavy clouds were building dark and ominous. "We've got a few hours at least." He unsaddled Cooper and rubbed the horse down with handfuls of pine needles to dry his sweat-dampened coat. Aita gathered fallen branches, breaking them into manageable pieces. Her movements were efficient, despite her fatigue, a testament to a life spent in the harsh realities of the frontier. Silas dug a small pit in the snow, lined it with stones he gathered from the creek bank, and built a careful fire, small enough to minimize smoke, but sufficient to ward off the killing cold of a mountain night. Once it was burning steadily, he turned his attention to his wounded arm. The bullet had cut a furrow along his upper arm, bloody, but not deep. Still, it needed cleaning. He shrugged out of his coat, grimacing, as dried blood pulled at the wound. Aita moved to his side without being asked. "Let me," she said simply. She took the canteen he offered, pouring water carefully over the wound to clean away dirt and dried blood. Her touch was gentle, but sure the hands of someone used to tending injuries. "Not bad," she observed. "No bullet inside." "Just a graze," Silas agreed, though it burned like fire. "Seen worse." She tore a strip from the bottom of her dress, already ragged, and bound the wound with practiced ease. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, studying his face in the flickering firelight. "You kill Reed," she said, not a question, but a statement. Silas nodded once. "Yes." "You not regret?" He considered the question, rolling it over in his mind like a stone. "No," he said finally. He deserved worse than he got. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, much worse." She looked away into the darkness beyond their small fire. "But killing him brings troubles. For you." "I'm already a wanted man now," Silas acknowledged. "Reed was a colonel, connected. When they find his body—" He didn't finish the thought. They both knew what it meant. "We should leave territory," Aita suggested. "Go far, where they not look." "Maybe," he agreed. "But first the Navajo settlement. We need supplies. And I need to know what Reed was really after." She frowned slightly. "You think not just gold. Reed never cared about money for its own sake," Silas explained. "He wanted power, influence." He stared into the fire, memories surfacing. When we served together, he was always angling for promotion, for connections to Washington. If he was out here hunting for Apache treasure, it wasn't just to line his pockets. Aita considered this. "The railroad," she said after a moment. "It wants land where sacred circles are." "Exactly," Silas nodded. "And Reed worked for the railroad now. The question is, what's so important about that specific land that Reed would go to these lengths?" They fell silent, each lost in thought, as the fire crackled and the wind began to rise, bringing the first flakes of a new snowfall. Silas added more wood to the fire, careful to keep the flames low. "Sleep," he told Aita. "I'll take first watch." She looked as if she might argue, but exhaustion won out. She curled up near the fire, pulling his coat tighter around her. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Silas leaned back against a tree trunk, his rifle across his knees. The night settled around them, the forest quiet, except for the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch and the soft hiss of snowflakes falling into the fire. He found his thoughts returning to Raven Ridge, to the day that had changed everything. 10 years earlier, the dawn had broken red over the hills, a blood-colored warning that Captain Silas Thornton ignored as he saddled his horse. The air was cold but dry, typical of early spring in the New Mexico territory. Around him, the camp was stirring soldiers, checking weapons and equipment with quiet efficiency. Colonel Montgomery Reed stood near the command tent, studying a map spread across a field table. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair despite being only in his 40s, his uniform immaculate even in field conditions. His eyes, a penetrating blue, lifted as Silas approached. "Ah, Captain Thornton," he said, his voice carrying the cultivated tones of an East Coast education. "Your scouts have returned." "Yes, sir," Silas replied, coming to attention. "They report no signs of hostile activity in the valley. The Apache camp appears to be mainly women, children, and older men. Most of the warriors are away hunting." A flicker of irritation crossed Reed's face. "Your scouts are mistaken," he said dismissively. "Intelligence from Fort Stanton confirms this is the band responsible for the attacks on the stagecoach line." Silas frowned. "Sir, with respect, my scouts are Navajo. They can tell the difference between peaceful villagers and war parties. This doesn't match the description of the hostile band." Reed straightened, fixing Silas with a cold stare. "Are you questioning orders, Captain?" "I'm providing information that could prevent a costly mistake," Silas replied, holding his ground. "If we attack a peaceful settlement, it could incite more violence, not less." Reed's expression hardened. "The orders come directly from Territorial Command Captain. This band is to be dealt with decisively." He folded the map with sharp, precise movements. "We move in 1 hour." As Reed walked away, Lieutenant James Wallace approached, his young face troubled. "He's wrong, isn't he?" he asked quietly. "About the village." Silas glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Yes," he said simply. "Something isn't right about this operation." "What do we do?" Silas checked his sidearm, his movements automatic. "Follow orders, but carefully. No unnecessary force. I want you to take the left flank and make sure your men understand we're securing a village, not massacring one." Wallace nodded, his expression grim. "And if it goes bad?" "Then we do what we can," Silas replied, "and hope it's enough." But it hadn't been enough. Not nearly. The attack began at mid-morning, the cavalry sweeping down into the valley with practiced precision. But instead of resistance, they found confusion. Women gathering, children, elders emerging from lodges, with hands raised, voices calling in Apache and broken English that they were peaceful, that there was a mistake. Silas had tried to call for a halt, had ridden to Reed's position shouting that these were not hostiles, that they needed to stand down. Reed had ignored him, ordering the men forward, and in the chaos that followed, someone fired the first shot. After that, it was a slaughter. Some of the soldiers, realizing what was happening, held their fire or deliberately shot wide. Others, caught in the frenzy or blindly following orders, fired into the fleeing villagers. Silas remembered riding through the smoke, shouting for the firing to stop, physically pulling one young soldier off a woman he was trying to drag from a burning lodge. He remembered seeing a young girl running directly into the line of fire of a group of soldiers and making a split-second decision to fire a warning shot that brought her down, not killing her, but stopping her long enough for the worst of the chaos to pass. And he remembered finding Reed afterward, standing calmly among the bodies, surveying the destruction with something like satisfaction in his cold blue eyes. This was wrong, Silas had said, his voice hoarse from shouting from smoke. These weren't hostiles. They were families. They were Apache, Reed had replied simply, as if that explained everything. And now they won't trouble the territory anymore. A successful operation, Captain. Washington will be pleased. Silas had resigned his commission that night, turning in his papers and riding away from the fort without looking back. He had thought naively that it was over, that by walking away he had separated himself from the horror of what had happened. But now, 10 years later, it had found him again, in the form of a woman who carried the scar of his bullet and a colonel who had finally paid for his crimes. Silas was pulled from his memories by a soft sound, Aita shifting in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Her face was troubled, caught in some dream or memory of her own. After a moment, she settled again, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He checked the sky through the branches above them. The clouds had thickened, the snowfall growing heavier. By morning, their tracks would be covered, which was both blessing and curse, harder for Reed's men to follow, but also harder for them to find their way. The night deepened. Silas fed the fire carefully, keeping it just strong enough to ward off the killing cold. His wounded arm throbbed, a steady pulse of pain that kept sleep at bay even when he grew tired enough to want it. Sometime in the darkest hours, Aita woke, sitting up, with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. Her eyes found his across the fire. "Your turn, sleep," she said quietly. "I watch." Silas hesitated, his instinct to protect warring with practical need. But she was right. He needed rest if they were to travel tomorrow. And she had proven herself more than capable. "Wake me if anything changes," he said, handing her the rifle. "If you hear anything, see anything." She nodded, taking the weapon with familiar ease. Silas stretched out by the fire, using his saddle as a pillow, his pistol still within easy reach. Despite the cold and his aching arm, exhaustion pulled him under quickly into a sleep filled with disjointed dreams of fire and snow. He woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through pine branches and the smell of something cooking. Sitting up, he found Aita crouched by the fire, roasting what looked like a small rabbit on a makeshift spit of green wood. "You hunted?" he asked, surprised and impressed. She glanced up. "Found snare. Not mine. Trapper, maybe. Took rabbit." She rotated the spit carefully. "Need food for journey." Silas couldn't argue with that logic, though he made a mental note to leave something in trade if they ever crossed paths with the trapper. He stretched, wincing at the stiffness in his wounded arm, and moved to check on Cooper. The horse had weathered the night well enough, though he would need proper feed soon. The snow had stopped, leaving a fresh blanket over everything, pristine and unmarked. The clouds were breaking up, allowing weak winter sunlight to filter through. "How far to Navajo?" Aita asked, as they shared the rabbit, eating quickly in the cold morning air. "If we push hard, we can reach it by nightfall," Silas replied. "But the snow will slow us down." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Reed's men will go to town first," she observed, "to get more men, then follow." "Probably," Silas agreed, "which gives us a day, maybe two, before they pick up our trail." After eating, they broke camp quickly, leaving as little trace of their presence as possible. Silas saddled Cooper, while Aita scattered the ashes of their fire and covered the site with fresh snow. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving again, following the winding course of the creek eastward. The day was clear, but bitterly cold, the kind of cold that finds its way through layers of clothing to settle in the bones. They rode in silence most of the morning, conserving energy, each lost in thought. Silas found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. Around midday, they came upon a ridge that offered a view back the way they had come. In the far distance, a smudge of dark smoke was still visible, the remains of Silas's cabin still smoldering. He stared at it for a long moment, thinking of all he had built there, now reduced to ash. "You regret?" Aita asked, following his gaze. Silas considered the question. "It was just a place," he said finally. "Wood and nails can build another." But even as he said it, he felt the loss not just of shelter, but of the solitude and peace he had found there after years of wandering. They continued on the terrain, gradually changing, as they descended from the higher elevations. The pines gave way to juniper and piñón, and the snow thinned in places where the sun had reached. By late afternoon, they could see the distant outline of mesas on the horizon. "Almost there," Silas said, pointing. "The Navajo settlement is in the valley beyond those mesas." Aida nodded, but there was a new tension in her posture. "Navajo and Apache not always friends," she said carefully. "These Navajo helped my unit sometimes," Silas explained. "Their headman, Hosteen So, was a scout for the army before retiring to his clan. He's a good man. He'll help us at least with supplies." She didn't look entirely convinced, but didn't argue. As they rode on, Silas became aware of something he hadn't noticed before, a subtle change in how Aida held herself on the horse, a new stiffness that suggested pain rather than just wariness. "You're hurt," he said, not a question. She glanced back at him. "Old wounds," she said dismissively. "From Reed's men, nothing new." But Silas wasn't so sure. He had seen how Reed had handled her at the cabin, how she had struggled with him. There might be injuries she wasn't mentioning. They reached the edge of the mesa country as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the red rock landscape. The trail descended through a narrow canyon winding between towering walls of sandstone. It was a defensible position Silas noted easy to guard against intruders. No doubt why the Navajo had chosen this location. As they emerged from the canyon into a broader valley, they saw the first signs of the settlement smoke from cooking fires rising in thin columns against the darkening sky, the silhouettes of hogans scattered among juniper trees. A small stream ran through the center of the valley, its banks lined with bare cottonwoods. They were spotted before they reached the first dwelling. A young Navajo man on horseback appeared from among the trees, a rifle held casually but obviously in his hands. He watched their approach with the impassive expression of a sentinel. Silas raised a hand in greeting, keeping it well away from his weapons. "Ya-at-e," he called, using one of the few Navajo words he knew, a general greeting. The young man studied them for a moment before responding. "Who comes to Tso clan?" he asked in accented but clear English. "Silas Thornton," Silas replied. "I was a scout with the army. Hosteen So knows me." The sentinel's eyes moved to Aida, taking in her Apache features and dress. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened. "And she is with me," Silas said simply. "We seek shelter and supplies. We can pay." He indicated the saddlebags where he kept what little money he had managed to salvage. The young man seemed to consider this, then nodded once. "Wait here," he said. "I will tell Hosteen So." He wheeled his horse and rode toward the center of the settlement, leaving them at the edge of the valley. Aida's voice was low when she spoke. "He not trust Apache." "No," Silas agreed. "But he'll trust Hosteen So's judgment, and Hosteen So will remember me." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the young sentinel returned, accompanied by an older man on a paint pony. Hosteen So had aged in the years since Silas had seen him. Last, his hair was now entirely silver, his face more deeply lined. But he sat straight in the saddle, and his eyes were sharp as they took in the visitors. "Silas Thornton," he said, his voice gravelly but strong. "Many winters since you ride with scouts." "Too many, Hosteen So," Silas replied respectfully. "Thank you for seeing us." The old man's gaze shifted to Aida. "Apache woman," he observed, "far from her people's lands." "Her name is Aida," Silas said. "She has no people left. Raven Ridge." Understanding flickered in the old man's eyes. The Navajo had heard of the massacre, as had most tribes in the territory. It was a name that carried weight. "Come," Hosteen So said after a moment. "Share our fire tonight. Tomorrow we talk of why Army Scout and Apache woman ride together with fresh bullet wound and smell of burning on their clothes. Silas felt a rush of relief. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was shelter for the night. Thank you, Hosteen So. They followed the old man into the settlement, aware of curious eyes watching from doorways and between buildings. The young sentinel continued to ride beside them, his rifle now slung across his back, but still within easy reach. Hosteen So led them to a large hogan near the center of the settlement. Outside it, a fire burned in a stone-lined pit. Several people gathered around it. They looked up as the riders approached, their expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness. Silas dismounted, then helped Aita down. He could feel her trembling slightly, whether from exhaustion or pain, he couldn't tell. But she stood straight, meeting the gazes of the Navajo with quiet dignity. An older woman emerged from the hogan. Hosteen So's wife, Silas guessed. She took one look at them and began issuing orders to the others. Soon food was being prepared, blankets brought out, and their horse led away to be cared for. Sit, Hosteen So said, gesturing to the fire. Eat, rest. Tomorrow is for talking. They did as instructed, gratefully accepting bowls of rich stew and flat bread. The food was simple but filling, and Silas realized how hungry he was. Beside him, Aita ate slowly, her eyes constantly moving, taking in everything around them. After the meal, Hosteen So's wife, who introduced herself as Najoni, showed them to a small guest hogan where they could sleep. It was warm inside, with clean bedding laid out on either side of a central fire pit. Thank you, Silas said as she turned to leave, for your hospitality. Najoni paused, studying him with wise old eyes. You bring trouble to our door, she observed, not unkindly. But my husband says you are a man of honor. We will see. With that, she was gone, closing the door behind her. Left alone, Silas sank onto one of the bedrolls, the events of the past days catching up to him. Across the small space, Aita sat cross-legged, staring into the small fire that had been prepared for them. Will they help us? She asked quietly. I don't know, Silas admitted. Hosteen So is fair-minded, but he has his people to think of, if helping us puts them at risk. He let the thought trail off. Aita nodded, understanding. We ask for supplies only, not stay. Yes, Silas agreed. And information, if they have it. He hesitated, then added, You should let Najoni look at your injuries. Navajo are known for their healing skills. She looked at him sharply. What injuries? Whatever Reed or his men did to you, Silas said. I can see it in how you move. For a moment, it seemed she might deny it again, then her shoulders sagged slightly. Old wounds reopened, she admitted. When Reed grabbed me, nothing serious. Still, let them help if they offer, Silas insisted. We have a long way to go, wherever we decide to go. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once in agreement. Satisfied, Silas stretched out on his bedroll, his body aching with fatigue. Despite the strangeness of their surroundings and the uncertainty that lay ahead, he felt sleep pulling at him. Rest, he told Aita. We're safe here for tonight at least. She nodded again but made no move to lie down. Instead, she remained sitting, her eyes on the fire, lost in thoughts he couldn't begin to guess. Silas watched her for a moment, struck by the strength she continued to show, despite everything she had endured. Then his eyes grew too heavy to keep open, and he surrendered to exhaustion. Silas woke to the sound of voices outside the hogan. Daylight filtered through the smoke hole in the roof, indicating he had slept through the night. He sat up immediately, alert, his hand reaching instinctively for his weapon before he remembered where they were. Across the hogan, Aita was already awake, sitting in the same position he had last seen her in. She looked as if she hadn't slept at all, her eyes tired but watchful. Riders came in night, she said quietly. 3 men talked long time with Hosteen So. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Reed's men, she shook her head. Navajo, from town. She nodded toward the door of the hogan. They leave before dawn, but Hosteen So wants talk now. Before Silas could respond, the door covering was pushed aside and Hosteen So himself entered. The old man's face was grave, his eyes troubled. "There is news from Santa Fe," he said without preamble. "Colonel Reed is dead. Shot at a trader's cabin in the mountains." His eyes fixed on Silas. "Your cabin, they say." Silas nodded, not seeing any point in denial. "Yes." Hosteen So's expression didn't change. "They say Apache woman was with him, that you stole her and killed Reed when he came to take her back." "That's not how it happened," Silas replied, keeping his voice level. "Reed had held her captive, tortured her for information. I found her after she escaped half dead in the snow." The old man's eyes moved to Aita. "Is this true?" She met his gaze steadily. "Yes. Reed wants sacred map. Think it leads to gold." "What map?" Silas and Aita exchanged a glance. After a moment, Aita reached into her coat and withdrew the piece of hide with its cryptic markings. Hosteen So took it, studying it with interest. "This is old," he said after a moment. "Very old. Apache signs, but not like any I have seen." "It shows the sacred places of my people," Aita explained, "where ceremonies happen, where ancestors sleep." Hosteen So returned the map piece with a nod of understanding. "And Reed thought it showed gold." "Yes," Silas confirmed. "He was working for the railroad now. They want that land for a new line. But I think there's more to it than that." The old man settled himself cross-legged by the small fire, his movements deliberate. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." So they did. Silas started with finding Aita in the ceremonial circle, explaining about the map fragments, Reed's appearance at his cabin, and their subsequent flight. Aita added her part, how Reed had captured her and others who survived Raven Ridge, believing they knew the location of Apache gold, and how she had escaped with one piece of the map. Throughout the telling, Hosteen So listened without interruption, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. Only when they had finished did he speak. "The men who came last night," he said, "they brought word that soldiers are looking for you both. There is a price now for the Apache woman alive, and for you, Silas Thornton, dead or alive." Silas had expected as much, but the confirmation was still sobering. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet," Hosteen So replied. "I said I would ask among my people if any had seen strangers." "We'll leave today," Silas said. "We don't want to bring trouble to your clan." The old man raised a hand. "Wait, there is more to this story than you know." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The railroad does not just want land for tracks. There is something else they seek. Something beneath the earth." Aita looked up sharply. "What do you think?" "Silver," Hosteen So said. "Much silver. My people have known of it for generations. The Apache, too, I think. But we leave it in the ground where Creator put it." Silas frowned. "You're saying there really is treasure. Not treasure as white men think," Hosteen So clarified. "Sacred material, used for ceremonies only, not for making rich." Aita's expression had gone very still. "The silver river beneath the mountain," she said quietly. "My father spoke of this, said never to tell white men." "Your father was wise," Hosteen So said, "but someone did tell. And now the railroad wants that silver. They will kill for it, as Reed tried to do. Silas's mind was working rapidly, connecting pieces. That's why Reed was so obsessed with the map. It doesn't just show sacred sites, it shows the location of the silver deposit. Yes, Hosteen So agreed. And now others will come looking for it. And for you. Silas ran a hand through his beard, thinking hard. We need to leave the territory, he said finally. Head north, maybe, or west to California. Hosteen So shook his head. They will follow. The railroad has many men, much money. And now they will say, you are murderer, that you kill Reed for map. What choice do we have? Silas asked. The old man was quiet for a moment, considering. There is another way, he said finally. But it is dangerous. What way? Aita asked. Complete the map, Hosteen So said. Find all pieces, then use it to find the Silver River, not to take but to protect, to show the world it is sacred place, not for railroad to destroy. Silas exchanged a glance with Aita, seeing the same doubt in her eyes that he felt. How would that help? The railroad won't care if it's sacred. But others might, Hosteen So replied. In Washington, there are men who speak for Indians. Few, but they exist. If they know railroad kills to take sacred land, maybe they listen. It seemed a slim hope to Silas, but he couldn't deny the logic. Running would only last so long. Eventually, they would be caught or worse. But if they could somehow expose what Reed and the railroad were really after, where would we find the other map pieces? He asked. One is here, Hosteen So said, surprising them both. Given to my grandfather by Apache medicine man long ago, for safekeeping. Aita leaned forward, her eyes intense. You have piece of sacred map. The old man nodded. And I know where one more might be. With trader called Mackenzie. He collects old things of native people. Thomas Mackenzie, Silas asked, the Scotsman who runs the trading post near Fort Stanton. Yes, Hosteen So confirmed. He has many Apache things. Some say stolen, some say bought. But he has them. Silas considered this new information. Mackenzie's trading post was a 3-day ride south in the opposite direction from where any pursuers would expect them to flee. It might give them a temporary advantage, though not much of one. If we had all the pieces, he said slowly, how would we use them to stop the railroad? First find Silver River, Hosteen So said. Then I send word to men I know in Santa Fe. Men who write for newspapers in East. They tell story of railroad killing for sacred land. Maybe it works, maybe not. But better than running forever. Silas looked at Aita, leaving the decision to her. It was her people's sacred map after all, her heritage at stake. She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes thoughtful. Then she nodded once, decisive. We find all pieces, she said. We protect Silver River, for all who died at Raven Ridge. Hosteen So nodded in approval. I will give you my piece, he said, and supplies for journey. But you must leave today. Already my people are uneasy with Apache and white man, who brings army trouble. We understand, Silas said, and we're grateful for your help. The old man rose with the fluid grace that belied his age. Rest now, he said. Eat. My wife will tend your wounds. When sun touches midday, you ride south. After he had gone, Silas turned to Aita. Are you sure about this? It's not too late to run north, try to lose ourselves in the mountains. She met his gaze, her expression resolute. Running solves nothing, she said. Reed dead, but others come. Always others. Must stop at source. Silas nodded slowly. She was right, though the path ahead was fraught with danger. All right, he agreed. We'll try it your way. True to his word, Hostinso returned at midday with supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies, and most precious of all, his piece of the sacred map. It was similar to the other fragments, but showed a different section of the terrain with different symbols marked upon it. When all pieces together, he explained, they show path to Silver River and way to open earth to reach it. Nijoni had insisted on examining both of them, her skilled hands finding injuries they hadn't even been aware of. She had redressed Silas's bullet wound and treated a set of bruised ribs that Aita had been concealing. Now, as they prepared to leave, she pressed a small pouch of herbs into Aita's hands. For pain, she said simply, and for strength. Aita accepted the gift with quiet dignity. Ahehi, she said, using the Navajo word for thank you that Nijoni had taught her. The old woman's face softened slightly. You have strong spirit, she observed. Like mountain lion, fierce but also wise. Before they mounted up, Hostinso drew Silas aside. There is one more thing you should know, he said, his voice low. The men who came last night, they say Reed was not working alone. A man in Washington gives orders. Man with much power. Did they know his name? Silas asked. Hostinso shook his head. Only that he was high in government, and that he wants silver very badly. This was troubling news. If Reed had been acting on behalf of someone in Washington, someone with real power, then the forces aligned against them were even greater than Silas had feared. Be careful who you trust, Hostinso advised, even among those who seem friendly. I will, Silas promised, and thank you for everything. The old man clasped his arm in a warrior's grip. May Creator watch over your path, he said solemnly. They rode out of the Navajo settlement just as the sun reached its zenith, heading south toward Fort Stanton and Mackenzie's trading post. Cooper had been fed and rested and moved with fresh energy beneath them. Silas rode behind Aita again, finding that they had developed a natural rhythm together on horseback. As the settlement disappeared behind them, Aita spoke. You trust Navajo, old man? Silas considered the question. Yes, he said finally. Hostinso has no reason to lie to us, and every reason to want the railroad stopped. They'll take Navajo land next if they can. She nodded, accepting his assessment. Then we find Trader, get next piece. And hope we're not riding into a trap, Silas added grimly. They pushed on through the afternoon, making good time across the high desert. The landscape here was different from the mountains, more open with long vistas across sage-dotted plains to distant mesas. It was beautiful in its stark way, but also dangerous. There was little cover making them visible to anyone who might be looking. As the sun began to set, they found a small arroyo, a dry stream bed that offered some shelter for the night. They made camp with the efficiency of those accustomed to hard travel, sharing a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from their supplies. Sitting by their small fire, Silas watched as Aita carefully laid out the 2 map fragments they now possessed, studying them in the flickering light. She traced the strange symbols with her fingertips, her expression intent. What do they mean? Silas asked. The symbols. She glanced up. Different things. This, she pointed to a spiral, means journey. This, a jagged line, means danger. Mountain that swallows men. And these, Silas indicated a series of dots arranged in a pattern. Stars, she said, to find way when no moon. She pointed to another section. These tell when to go, which moon, which season. Some places only open at certain times. Silas leaned closer, fascinated despite himself. "And this?" he asked, indicating a symbol that appeared on both fragments, a circle with radiating lines like a sun. Aita's expression grew solemn. "Silver River," she said quietly. "Sacred place where Earth's blood flows." "Earth's blood, what my people call silver," she explained. "Blood of Mother Earth, very powerful, very dangerous, if not respected." Silas sat back, thinking. So the map doesn't just show where the silver is. It shows how to reach it safely. "Yes," she confirmed. "Ways in, ways out, times to go, times to stay away." Very old knowledge. "And Reed thought it was just a treasure map," Silas said, shaking his head at the irony. "He never understood what he really had." "White men rarely understand," Aita said, though there was more sadness than bitterness in her voice. "They see only what can be taken sold, not what must be protected respected." "Not all white men," Silas said quietly. She met his eyes across the fire. "No," she agreed after a moment. "Not all." They were quiet then, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional call of a night bird. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear desert air, a canopy of light stretching from horizon to horizon. "We should sleep," Silas said eventually. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Aita nodded carefully, rewrapping the map fragments and tucking them away. "I take first watch," she offered. Silas started to protest, then stopped himself. She was as capable as he was, maybe more so in some ways, and they needed to trust each other if they were going to survive what lay ahead. "Wake me in 4 hours," he said instead. She nodded agreement, settling herself with her back against a rock rifle across her knees, in a mirror of how he had kept watch the night before. Silas stretched out near the fire, his saddle as a pillow, and closed his eyes. His last thought before sleep claimed him was that, for all the danger they faced, he was no longer alone. After years of solitude, of carrying the weight of Raven Ridge by himself, he now had someone who understood. Someone who had been there, who had suffered because of the same events, yet had found the strength to go on. Whether they succeeded in their quest or not, that shared understanding was a gift he had never expected to receive. Silas woke suddenly, every sense alert, though he wasn't immediately sure what had disturbed his sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow over their small camp. Across from him, Aita sat motionless, her rifle ready, her eyes fixed on something beyond the edge of the arroyo. He followed her gaze, but saw nothing in the darkness. Then he heard it, the soft nicker of a horse, quickly silenced. Someone was out there. Silently, Silas reached for his pistol, the movement covered by the blanket he had been sleeping under. Aita's eyes flicked to him, acknowledging his wakefulness, then back to the edge of the arroyo. "How many?" he mouthed silently. She held up 3 fingers, then pointed to different positions around their camp. They were surrounded. Silas weighed their options. They could try to fight the arroyo, provided some cover, and both of them were good shots. But if their attackers were military, or Reed's well-armed men, they might be outgunned. Running wasn't much of an option either. Their horse was tethered nearby, visible to whoever was out there. Before he could decide on a course of action, a voice called down from the edge of the arroyo. "Silas Thornton, we know you're down there. Come out with your hands up and bring the Apache woman with you." Silas's blood ran cold. He recognized that voice, Lieutenant James Wallace, his former subordinate from Raven Ridge. But Wallace wouldn't be a lieutenant anymore. 10 years would have seen him promoted possibly to captain or even major by now. "Wallace," he called back. "Is that you?" There was a moment of silence then. "Captain Thornton?" It's been a long time. It's not Captain anymore, Silas replied, playing for time as he tried to think. I resigned, remember. I remember, Wallace replied. Just after Raven Ridge, some of us wondered where you'd gone. Why are you here, Wallace? Silas asked, though he could guess the answer. Official business, came the reply. Colonel Reed was found dead at your cabin. The Apache woman was seen with you. I'm afraid you're both wanted for questioning. Silas exchanged a glance with Aita. Questioning was a polite way of saying arrest, trial, and likely execution, at least for him. For Aita, it might be worse, returning to captivity, more torture for information about the map and the silver. Reed was holding her prisoner, Silas called back. Torturing her for information. I found her half dead in the snow. That's not the story we heard, Wallace replied. Reed was working for the railroad. He was a respected officer. And you've been living wild out here for years. People say you've gone native Thornton, that you can't be trusted. Silas felt anger rising but kept his voice level. Reed was corrupt, Wallace. He always was. Even back at Raven Ridge. He falsified intelligence, led us into a peaceful village, and ordered a massacre. You were there. You saw it. There was a longer silence this time. When Wallace spoke again, his voice was lower, as if he didn't want to be overheard by his men. I know what happened at Raven Ridge, he said. I've had to live with it too, but this isn't about that. It's about now. About Reed. It's all connected, Silas insisted. Reed was still hunting Apache, still killing for what he wanted. Only now, it was silver, not land. Silver, Wallace sounded genuinely puzzled. What silver? Silas hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Beside him, Aita shook her head slightly, a warning not to trust too easily. Ask your superiors, Silas said finally. Ask who Reed was really working for. It wasn't just the railroad. Another silence. Silas could almost feel Wallace's indecision. Then, come out, Thornton. Bring the woman. I'll make sure you get a fair hearing. I owe you that much. Silas didn't believe it for a second. Even if Wallace meant what he said, he couldn't guarantee anything once they were in custody. I can't do that, Wallace, he replied. Not until I know the truth. Not until I can prove what Reed was really doing out here. Don't be a fool, Wallace's voice sharpened with frustration. There are a dozen men with me. You can't escape. Maybe not, Silas acknowledged. But we can make it costly enough that you might think twice. A tense silence followed. Silas could imagine Wallace weighing his options, calculating the potential loss of men against the importance of his orders. Suddenly, Aita touched his arm, pointing to the far end of the arroyo. In the faint starlight, Silas could just make out a narrow gap in the rock wall. A side channel, potentially. An escape route. How far? He whispered. Not far, she whispered back. Goes to back of ridge. Horse cannot follow. Silas nodded his understanding. They would have to leave Cooper behind, but it might be their only chance. Thornton, Wallace called again. I'm giving you one last chance. Surrender now, or we open fire. Silas made his decision. In one smooth motion, he rolled away from the fire, drawing his pistol as he moved. Run, he hissed to Aita. Go. She was already moving swift and silent, as a shadow heading for the narrow gap in the rock. Silas fired 2 shots in the direction of Wallace's voice, not aiming to hit, but to force them to take cover, then sprinted after her. Behind them, the night erupted in gunfire. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, ricocheted off rocks with whining sounds. But they had the advantage of darkness and surprise, and the arroyo's twisting path provided some cover. Aita reached the gap first, squeezing through the narrow opening. Silas followed, feeling the rough stone scrape against his shoulders. Behind them, men were shouting, scrambling to pursue. But the gap was too narrow for more than one person at a time, giving them a critical head start. The side channel was steeper, climbing rapidly up the back of the ridge. They scrambled upward using hands and feet on the rough terrain, driven by the urgency of pursuit. Silas's wounded arm protested at the treatment, but adrenaline pushed him through the pain. They reached the top of the ridge just as the first of their pursuers entered the side channel below. Without pausing to rest, they continued on, running along the ridgeline before dropping down the far side out of sight of Wallace and his men. The night swallowed them as they fled into the desert, two fugitives bound together by circumstance and a shared quest to find the remaining pieces of an ancient map, and with it, perhaps, a path to justice. Dawn found Silas and Aita crouched in the shelter of a sandstone overhang, miles from where they had encountered Wallace and his men. They had traveled through the night, moving steadily southward, stopping only when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Their flight had cost them dearly. Cooper was gone along with most of their supplies. All they had managed to keep were their weapons, the precious map fragments, and whatever they had been carrying in their pockets. Silas leaned against the cool stone, his wounded arm throbbing anew from the exertion. Beside him, Aita sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her dark eyes alert despite her obvious fatigue. Neither had spoken much during their desperate journey, saving their breath for the hard travel across rough terrain. Now, as the first light of day spilled across the desert, Silas assessed their situation. They were somewhere in the Badlands south of the Navajo settlement, a harsh landscape of twisted rock formations and deep ravines. The good news was that the terrain made pursuit difficult. The bad news was that it made travel equally challenging, especially without a horse. "Water first," he said, breaking the long silence. "Then we need to figure out exactly where we are." Aita nodded. "Creek nearby," she said. "I smell it." Silas raised an eyebrow, impressed, but not surprised by her wilderness skills. He had grown to respect her capabilities more with each passing day. Together, they made their way down a steep slope of loose shale, moving carefully to avoid sending rocks tumbling and giving away their position. At the bottom, just as Aita had predicted, they found a small creek winding its way through the ravine. The water was clear and cold, fed by mountain snow. They drank deeply, then filled the single canteen they had managed to keep. As they rested by the creek, Silas studied the surrounding terrain. The sun was rising to their left, confirming they were still heading south. Fort Stanton and Mackenzie's trading post lay in that direction, perhaps 2 days' journey on foot through this difficult country. "Wallace will keep looking," Aita said, voicing what they both knew. "Many men, horses." "Yes," Silas agreed, "but they'll expect us to head for the border, south into Mexico or west to Arizona territory. They won't expect us to go toward Fort Stanton." She considered this. "Because it is toward danger, not away." "Exactly. Sometimes the safest path is through the fire, not around it." Aita's lips curved in a small, grim smile. "Apache know this too. When hunters surround, sometimes best path is to charge strongest one. Surprise." They rested for an hour, allowing their bodies some recovery from the night's exertion. Silas checked his weapons. The pistol was still fully loaded, but he had only a dozen rounds for the rifle. Aita had even less ammunition for the old Spencer carbine she had taken from the Navajo settlement. They would need to be very careful with their shots if it came to a fight. As the sun climbed higher, they set out again, following the creek southward. The ravine provided good cover, though it meant their path wasn't direct. They moved at a steady pace, conserving energy for what promised to be a long journey. "What Wallace said," Aita began, after they had been walking for some time, About Reed. You think he not know about silver? Silas considered the question. Wallace was always a straight arrow, too trusting of authority. If Reed was working for someone higher up, someone in Washington, Wallace might not know the whole story. Or he lie, she suggested. Possible, Silas conceded. But I knew him, served with him. He's not a good enough actor to fake that kind of confusion. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts, as they navigated the rugged terrain. The day grew warmer, the sun beating down from a cloudless sky. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, forcing them to seek shelter in the shadow of a large boulder. As they shared a meager meal of jerky from their remaining supplies, Silas found himself studying Aita. Despite everything, the hardship, the danger, the physical toll of their journey, there was a resolute strength to her that he couldn't help but admire. She had endured things that would have broken most people, yet she carried on with a quiet dignity that spoke of deep inner resources. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze. "Nothing," he replied. "Just thinking that you're probably the strongest person I've ever met." She looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Strong because must be," she said simply, "or die." Silas nodded, understanding. Survival was a powerful motivator. He had seen it in war men accomplishing impossible feats simply because the alternative was death. But there was something more to Aita's strength, something that transcended mere survival. "Not just that," he said. "You could have given up, given Reed what he wanted, maybe saved yourself some pain. But you didn't." She met his eyes then. "Map not mine to give," she said. "Belongs to all Apache. To ancestors. Would be like," she searched for words, "like selling mother to save self." The simplicity and depth of her conviction struck him. In a world where most people's principles had a price, Aita's seemed unshakable. It made his own compromises over the years seem shallow by comparison. They continued their journey as the afternoon wore on, the landscape gradually changing as they moved south. The stark Badlands gave way to more open country rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon pine. It offered less cover, but allowed for faster travel. By late afternoon, they had covered a significant distance. Silas estimated they were now less than a day and a half's walk from Fort Stanton. If they pushed hard, they might reach Mackenzie's trading post by the following evening. As dusk approached, they found a suitable campsite in a small grove of junipers. Without the tools to build a proper fire, they made do with a tiny blaze just enough to ward off the desert chill. They kept watch in shifts, both too wary of pursuit to risk simultaneous sleep. During his watch, Silas found his thoughts returning to the conversation with Wallace. Something about it troubled him beyond the obvious danger it had posed. Wallace had seemed genuinely confused about the silver. If Reed hadn't shared that information with his own men, it suggested the matter was even more sensitive than they had assumed. And who was the man in Washington that Hosteen So had mentioned? Someone with enough power to command a former colonel to authorize whatever means necessary to secure the silver deposit. Not just a railroad executive or local politician, but someone much higher up the chain. When Aita woke for her shift, Silas shared his concerns. "I think we're dealing with something bigger than we realized," he concluded. "This isn't just about a railroad line or even a silver mine. There's something else going on." She considered this, her face solemn in the fading firelight. "Navajo elders say silver is sacred. Maybe special kind, different from other silver." "Maybe," Silas agreed. "Or maybe it's about the location, the land itself." "Land always important," she said, "to white men as much as Apache. Just for different reasons." They spoke little after that, conserving their energy for the journey ahead. But Silas could feel the weight of their quest, growing heavier. They weren't just running for their lives anymore. They were pushing toward some larger truth, one that powerful men wanted to keep hidden. The next day dawned clear and cold. They set out at first light, moving through terrain that gradually became more familiar to Silas. He had passed this way many times during his years as a scout, leading army patrols between forts. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge that offered a view of the country ahead. In the distance, the dark line of a river wound through the landscape, and beyond it, the faint smudge of buildings, Fort Stanton. Mackenzie's trading post lay closer, perhaps 5 miles ahead, nestled in a small valley where several trails converged. "We need to be careful from here," Silas said. "The fort will have heard about us by now. There could be patrols." Aita nodded, her eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced gaze of a hunter. "We go around," she suggested, pointing to a line of low hills that curved east of their position. "Come to Trader from behind." "Good idea," Silas agreed. "We'll approach after dark, less chance of being seen." And they spent the remainder of the day making their way through the hills, moving slowly and staying low whenever open ground had to be crossed. The landscape here was more populated. They passed several small homesteads, carefully avoiding being spotted by the inhabitants. As the sun began to set, they reached a position overlooking Mackenzie's trading post. It was a substantial building of adobe and timber with several outbuildings and corrals. A few horses were visible in the yard, and smoke rose from the chimney. A wagon was parked out front, suggesting customers or deliveries. "Busy," Aita observed, her voice low. "That could work in our favor," Silas replied. "Easier to blend in." He studied the trading post through narrowed eyes. "Mackenzie lives in rooms at the back. If he has the map piece, that's where it would be." They watched as darkness fell, noting the movements around the trading post. Several men departed on horseback, likely heading back to homes or camps in the area. Lanterns were lit inside, their warm glow spilling from windows into the gathering night. "How we get inside?" Aita asked. Silas considered their options. They couldn't simply walk in, not with their descriptions likely posted in every fort and settlement in the territory. But they needed to speak with Mackenzie to persuade him to show them the map piece if he indeed had it. "I knew Mackenzie years back," Silas said finally. "He was always more interested in artifacts than in politics, and he had no love for the army or the government. If we can get to him privately, explain what's happening, he might help us." "If he not shoot first," Aita added dryly. "There is that risk," Silas acknowledged, "but I don't see a better option." They waited until the trading post appeared to be closing for the night. The last customers departed, and most of the lights inside were extinguished, leaving only a glow from what Silas knew to be Mackenzie's private quarters. Under the cover of full darkness, they made their approach, moving silently across the open ground to the rear of the building. A small window there looked into Mackenzie's living space, and a faint light flickered within, probably a reading lamp, as Mackenzie was known to be a scholar of sorts. Silas peered cautiously through the glass. Inside, he could see a cluttered room filled with books, artifacts, and curiosities from various tribes. Seated at a desk, his back to the window, was a figure Silas recognized immediately. Thomas Mackenzie, his red hair now streaked with gray, but his broad shoulders and distinctive profile unchanged. Silas tapped lightly on the glass. Mackenzie turned, startled, his hand moving instinctively towards something on his desk. A weapon, most likely. Silas raised his hands to show they were empty, then gestured for Mackenzie to come to the window. After a moment's hesitation, the trader rose and approached. When he saw Silas's face, his eyes widened in recognition. He glanced around as if checking for witnesses, then unlatched the window and pushed it open. "Thornton," he whispered, his Scottish burr still strong, despite years in the territory. What in God's name are you doing here? There are posters with your face all over the fort. I need your help. Mac, Silas replied quietly. It's a long story, but I'm not what those posters say I am. Mackenzie's eyes moved to Aita, standing slightly behind Silas. And the Apache woman, they say you killed Reed over her. Reed was torturing her for information, Silas said bluntly. I found her half dead in the snow. What happened at my cabin was self-defense. The Scotsman studied them both for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he stepped back from the window. Come around to the side door, he said. Quickly, before anyone sees you. They did as instructed, slipping around to a small door that Mackenzie opened just wide enough for them to enter. The room beyond was as cluttered as it had appeared from outside, every surface covered with books, papers, and tribal artifacts. A fire burned low in a stone hearth, and a single lamp cast a circle of warm light near the desk. Mackenzie closed and bolted the door behind them. Sit, he said, gesturing to a pair of worn armchairs near the fire. You look half dead, both of you. As they gratefully sank into the chairs, Mackenzie moved to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. He poured generous measures and handed them around, then took a seat opposite his unexpected guests. Now, he said after taking a long swallow of the fiery liquid, tell me what's really going on, and why you're foolish enough to come within 10 miles of a fort that's actively looking for you. Silas took a small sip of whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through his tired body. We're looking for something, Mac. Something you might have. An old Apache artifact, a piece of hide with symbols drawn on it. Part of a map. Mackenzie's eyebrows rose. A map. He glanced at Aita. Is that what Reed was after? What he hurt you for? Aita nodded once, her face impassive. The trader leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. I might have something like that, he admitted. Came to me years ago from a soldier who'd been at Raven Ridge. Said he found it on a dead medicine man. Silas and Aita exchanged a glance. This was promising a third piece of the map, potentially bringing them closer to completing the puzzle. Can we see it? Silas asked. Mackenzie studied them both, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. First, tell me why you're looking for it. The whole truth, mind. I've known you too long to be fooled by half measures, Thornton. So Silas told him about finding Aita, about the ceremonial circle, about Reed's obsession with the Apache gold that was actually silver. He explained about the sacred sites and how the railroad wanted the land not just for tracks, but for what lay beneath it. He left nothing out, including their encounter with Hosteen So and their narrow escape from Wallace and his men. Throughout the telling, Mackenzie listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When Silas finished, the trader drained his glass and refilled it. I always knew Reed was a cold bastard, he said finally. But this, he shook his head. And you say there's someone in Washington behind it all? That's what Hosteen So's sources indicated, Silas confirmed. Someone with real power. Mackenzie rose and moved to a large oak cabinet against one wall. From it he withdrew a small wooden box intricately carved with tribal designs. He brought it to the desk and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in faded red cloth, lay a piece of hide similar to the 2 fragments they already possessed. The same strange symbols were drawn upon it, though the section of terrain it depicted was different. I've had scholars look at this, Mackenzie said gently, lifting the artifact. None could make sense of it. Some thought it religious, others astronomical. None guessed it was a map. Aita rose and approached the desk, her movements respectful. May I? She asked. Mackenzie handed her the hide piece. She held it reverently, her fingers tracing the symbols with practiced ease. "This shows path through canyon," she said softly, "where water runs under stone. Sacred place." Silas joined her at the desk, withdrawing the two fragments they carried. When placed together with Mackenzie's piece, they formed a larger section of the map, though still incomplete. "How many pieces in total?" Mackenzie asked. "4, we think," Silas replied. "We have 3 now. The last one," he looked at Aita. "Last piece with Reed's men," she said. "Or sent to man in Washington." Mackenzie frowned. "That complicates matters." "We know," Silas acknowledged, "but even with these 3, we might be able to locate the Silver River. Enough to understand what makes it so important, at least." The trader was quiet for a moment, studying the assembled map fragments. "You realize what you're up against," he said finally. "It's not just Reed's men or even the army. If there's someone in Washington pulling strings, they won't stop until they have what they want." "We know," Silas said again, "but we have to try. Otherwise, Reed died for nothing, and they'll just send someone else after Aida after the map. It never ends." Mackenzie looked between them, seeing the determination in both their faces. "You're not just trying to clear your names, are you? You actually believe you can stop this thing?" "Maybe not stop it," Silas conceded, "but expose it. Make enough noise that it can't happen in the shadows anymore." The trader nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'm in. The piece is yours, and I'll help however I can." Relief washed over Silas. Having an ally, especially one with Mackenzie's connections, improved their chances significantly. "Thank you, Mac." "Don't thank me yet," Mackenzie replied grimly. "You still need to get out of here alive. The fort's been on alert since word came about Reed. Patrols everywhere checking everyone who passes through." "We need supplies," Silas said. "Food, ammunition. Another horse, if possible." "I can help with most of that," the trader agreed. "But a horse will be tricky. Every mount in the area is accounted for, and questions would be asked." He thought for a moment. "There's a mescalero camp about 20 miles southeast. They owe me some favors. If you can make it there, I can send word ahead. They might provide horses and guides who know the territory better than any white man." Aita looked up sharply. "Mescalero, not always friends with my people," she said. "These ones have no quarrel with anyone except the army," Mackenzie assured her. "Their headman, Kianata, is a reasonable sort, more interested in peace than old feuds." Silas considered the option. It was risky, but everything they did now carried risk. "All right," he agreed. "If you can send word, we'll try for the Mescalero camp." "You'll need to leave before dawn," Mackenzie said. "Sleep here tonight. I'll gather what you need and wake you early." The offer of safe shelter was too welcome to refuse. After a simple meal that Mackenzie prepared, the first hot food they'd had since leaving the Navajo settlement, they spread blankets near the fire. Silas tried to insist that Aida take the bed, but she refused, preferring to sleep where she could see both the door and window. As they settled in for the night, Silas felt a cautious optimism beginning to take root. They had the third map piece. They had an ally in Mackenzie. If they could reach the Mescalero camp and get horses, they might actually have a chance of finding the Silver River and uncovering the truth behind Reed's deadly obsession. But as he drifted toward sleep, a nagging doubt remained. The fourth piece of the map was still missing, likely in the hands of their enemies. And without it, would they be able to find what they sought? Or were they risking everything on a journey that might lead nowhere? He glanced at Aita, already asleep by the fire. Her face softened in repose. For her, this wasn't just about survival or clearing their names. It was about honoring her people, protecting what was sacred. That kind of purpose gave strength beyond mere determination. Perhaps it would be enough. They left Mackenzie's trading post in the gray hour before dawn, slipping out the same side door through which they had entered. The trader had been generous. They carried new packs filled with food, ammunition, medical supplies, and other essentials. He had also provided them with rough, hand-drawn maps of the territory southeast of Fort Stanton, marking the location of the Mescalero camp and the terrain they would need to navigate to reach it. "I've sent a rider ahead," Mackenzie had told them as they prepared to leave. "An Apache boy who works for me sometimes. He'll reach the camp well before you do," explained the situation to Kianata. Now, as they made their way through the pre-dawn darkness, Silas found himself grateful once again for Aita's keen senses. She moved with the confidence of one who could read the land even in near darkness, leading them safely away from the trading post and into the hills beyond. They traveled steadily through the morning, pushing southeast as Mackenzie had directed. The terrain here was more forgiving than the badlands they had crossed earlier, rolling hills covered in grass and scattered juniper with clear streams running through the valleys. Under different circumstances, it would have been pleasant country to traverse. By midday, they had covered a significant distance thanks in part to the improved trail and their rested bodies. They paused near a stream to eat and refill their canteens. As they rested in the shade of a cottonwood, Silas spread out the 3 map fragments on a flat rock, studying them carefully. "Can you make sense of it?" he asked Aita, "even without the 4th piece?" She knelt beside him, her dark eyes intent as she examined the assembled fragments. "Not all," she admitted. "But some, yes." She pointed to a series of symbols on Mackenzie's piece. "This shows canyon that leads to Silver River, very narrow. Hard to find, unless no signs." "And you know these signs?" She nodded. "My father teach me, when I was child." A shadow crossed her face. "Before Raven Ridge." Silas studied the map more closely. The 3 pieces they had formed an irregular shape with an obvious gap where the 4th piece would fit. Even incomplete, it depicted a rugged landscape of mountains, canyons, and watersheds, all marked with the mysterious Apache symbols. "Where would the Silver River be?" he asked. Aita pointed to an area near the edge of the assembled pieces partially cut off by the missing 4th fragment. "Here, I think, where lines come together like spiderweb." Silas considered this. "And that's in the Sacred Mountains, the ones the railroad wants to cut through." "Yes," she confirmed. "Sierra Blanca, White Mountains, old place, powerful." She traced a route across the map with her finger. "From Mescalero camp, 2 days' ride, maybe 3. They repacked the precious fragments carefully, then continued their journey. The afternoon brought a change in the weather clouds building to the west, the air growing heavier with the promise of rain. By late afternoon, thunder rumbled in the distance and the wind had picked up considerably. "Storm coming," Aita observed, glancing at the darkening sky. "Big one," Silas nodded. "We need to find shelter before it hits, somewhere defensible with a good view of the approaches." They pushed on, searching for suitable shelter as the storm drew closer. Eventually they found what they were looking for, a small cave in the side of a rocky outcrop, elevated enough to offer a view of the surrounding terrain, but sheltered from the coming rain. They reached it just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Inside the cave was dry and relatively clean, showing no signs of recent animal habitation. It extended back about 20 feet into the rock, providing ample space for them to spread their bedrolls and build a small fire near the entrance. As the storm intensified outside, rain lashing down in sheets driven by gusting wind, they settled in for the night. The fire cast flickering shadows on the cave walls, and the thunder's deep rumble echoed through the stone around them. "Reminds me of nights on campaign," Silas said, his voice low. finding whatever shelter we could, waiting out the weather. Aita glanced at him across the fire. You miss it, being soldier. Silas considered the question. Not the killing, he said finally, but the purpose sometimes. The clarity of knowing exactly what you were supposed to do each day. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks drifting upward. After I left the army, I drifted for a long time. No purpose, just survival. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Same for me. After Raven Ridge, just run, hide, survive. Nothing more. And now, he asked. Now have purpose again, she said simply. Protect sacred places. Honor ancestors. She paused, then added quietly, not be alone. Those last words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Silas felt their weight and the truth of them. Despite the danger they faced, despite the uncertainty of their quest, neither of them was alone anymore. They had found in each other something unexpected, a companion who understood, who had walked a similar path of loss and survival. No, he agreed softly, not alone. The storm raged on outside, but within the cave, a different kind of peace had settled. They took turns keeping watch through the night, each resting more deeply than they had in days, knowing the other was there, vigilant and steady. Dawn brought clearing skies and renewed purpose. They set out early, making good time across terrain, washed clean by the night's storm. According to Mackenzie's map, they were now less than 10 miles from the Mescalero camp, and if they pushed hard, they could reach it by mid-afternoon. As they traveled, Silas found himself watching Aita, noticing the subtle changes in her since they had begun their journey together. The wariness that had marked her features when he first found her was still there, but tempered now by something else, a quiet confidence, perhaps even hope. She moved with purpose, her steps sure, her eyes clear and determined. For his part, Silas felt changed as well. The solitude he had wrapped around himself like armor for so many years had begun to fall away. In its place was something he had thought lost forever, a sense of connection, of shared purpose. They reached a high ridge around midday and paused to survey the country ahead. Below them stretched a broad valley, a silver ribbon of river winding through its center. Near the river, barely visible at this distance, was a collection of structures, the Mescalero camp, according to Mackenzie's map. We're close, Silas observed. Aita nodded, her eyes scanning the valley carefully. No soldiers, she noted. Good sign. They began their descent into the valley, moving more cautiously now. As they approached the camp, they could see it more clearly, a mixture of traditional Apache wickiups and more permanent wooden structures. Horses grazed in a meadow nearby, and smoke rose from several cooking fires. When they were within half a mile, they were met by riders, 3 Mescalero men on horseback, armed but not obviously hostile. The leader, a middle-aged warrior with a weathered face and keen eyes, addressed them in Apache, then switched to English when he saw Silas. "You Thornton," he asked. "Mackenzie sent word about you." Silas nodded. "Yes, this is Aita. We seek Kianata." The warrior studied them both, his expression giving nothing away. "Follow," he said, finally wheeling his horse. "Kianata wait for you." They were led into the camp, aware of curious eyes, watching from doorways and around cooking fires. The Mescalero seemed cautious, but not openly hostile. Mackenzie's message had apparently been received and taken seriously. At the center of the camp stood a large structure, part traditional wickiup, part wooden cabin. Here they were directed to enter, leaving their weapons outside as a sign of respect and peaceful intentions. Inside, seated on a woven mat near a central fire pit, was a man who could only be Kianata. He was older than Silas had expected perhaps, in his 70s with a deeply lined face and white hair worn long in the traditional style. Despite his age, he sat straight, his dark eyes sharp and assessing as the visitors were brought before him. "The trader Mackenzie speaks well of you, Silas Thornton," Kianata said in surprisingly good English. "He says you are a man of honor, who treats the people with respect." "Mackenzie is generous in his assessment," Silas replied, inclining his head respectfully, "but I try to live honorably." Kianata's gaze shifted to Aita. He addressed her in Apache, a dialect different from her own, but close enough to understand. She replied in kind, her voice steady and respectful. Silas caught only fragments of the exchange, but he could tell it concerned her band, her connection to the sacred map, and the events at Raven Ridge. Finally, Kianata switched back to English. "Mackenzie says you seek horses and guides to find the Silver River. A dangerous quest." "Yes," Silas acknowledged, "but necessary. Men from the government seek to desecrate sacred Apache land, to take the silver for themselves. We hope to stop them, or at least expose their plans." Kianata was silent for a long moment, his aged fingers tracing patterns on the woven mat before him. "The Silver River is known to my people as well," he said finally. "Not our sacred place, but we respect its power. The old ones say it is not like other silver. It is pure, untouched, blessed by Creator." "That's why they want it," Silas said. "Read The Man Who Died. He was working for someone powerful, someone who wants that silver badly enough to kill for it." "White men have killed for less," Kianata observed without rancor, simply stating a fact. "But this silver, it is different, special." He looked at Aita. "Your father was keeper of ceremonies. He would understand." She nodded. "My father says Silver River is where Earth's blood flows. Very powerful, very dangerous if not respected." "Yes," Kianata agreed. "This is why the map was made in pieces long ago, so no one person could find the river without permission of many bands." Silas leaned forward slightly. "We have 3 pieces now," he said. "The 4th is missing, likely in the hands of those who would exploit the silver." Kianata's expression grew grave. "3 may be enough if you have the knowledge to read them. But the journey is dangerous, not just because of white men who hunt you, but because of the land itself. The mountains guard their secrets." "Will you help us?" Silas asked directly. "Provide horses, perhaps guides, who know the terrain." The old man considered this for a long moment. "I will consult with the elders," he said finally. "Tonight we will give you our answer. Until then, rest, eat. You are welcome as guests in our camp." They were shown to a small wickiup where they could rest, and food was brought, a stew of rabbit and wild greens with fresh bread. It was the best meal they had eaten in days, and they ate gratefully, aware of the hospitality being extended to them. As evening approached, Silas stepped outside to stretch his legs and take stock of their surroundings. The camp was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with perhaps 30 structures and 100 or more inhabitants. Despite the rumors of Apache hostility that circulated in white settlements, what he observed here was a community going about its daily life. Women grinding corn, men working on tools or weapons, children playing games in the dust. He was watching a group of young boys practicing with small bows when Aita joined him, her expression thoughtful after hours of rest. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Will they help us?" She considered the question. Kianata respects Mackenzie, and he understands importance of sacred places. She gestured toward the mountains visible in the distance. "Sierra Blanca, important to Mescalero, too. Not same way as my people, but still sacred." "And if they don't help?" "Then we go alone," she said simply. Map shows way, just harder, without guides. Silas nodded. Her determination matched his own. They would find the Silver River with or without help, though having Mescalero guides would certainly improve their chances. As darkness fell, a messenger came to summon them back to Kianata's dwelling. There they found not just the chief, but several other elders, as well men and women of advanced age who regarded the visitors with solemn interest. Kianata gestured for them to sit. "We have spoken of your request," he said. "It is not a simple matter." "We understand," Silas replied, keeping his voice respectful. "Some say we should not involve ourselves in matters between white men and other Apache bands," Kianata continued, "that it brings only trouble to our people who have seen enough trouble already." Silas nodded, acknowledging the wisdom of this perspective. The Mescalero had indeed suffered greatly at the hands of both the army and settlers over the years. Their caution was well-founded. Others, Kianata went on, say that the sacred places of all Apache are connected, that if one is desecrated, all suffer, that if the Silver River is taken by white men for their machines and their greed, something valuable will be lost forever. There were murmurs of agreement from several of the elders at this. "I say both views have truth," Kianata concluded. "And so we will help you, but carefully. 2 guides, 2 horses, supplies for the journey. The guides will take you to the edge of the sacred mountains. Beyond that, you must go alone, as outsiders are forbidden in the most sacred places." Relief washed over Silas. It was more than he had dared hope for. "Thank you, Kianata. Your generosity honors us." The old man raised a hand. "There is one condition. If you find the Silver River, you must not take from it, not even a small piece. You may look, you may learn what makes it special, but you must leave it as Creator placed it." "Of course," Silas agreed immediately. "We seek to protect, not to take." Aita nodded her agreement as well, adding something in Apache that made several of the elders nod in approval. "Then it is settled," Kianata said. "You will leave at dawn tomorrow. My grandson, Nakohe, and his cousin Tarak will guide you. They know the mountains better than any." With that, the meeting concluded. As they returned to their wickiup, Silas felt a surge of hope. With horses' guides and the 3 map pieces, they stood a real chance of reaching the Silver River, of discovering what made it so valuable that men like Reed would kill for it, that someone in Washington would orchestrate its seizure from afar. But with hope came renewed wariness. If they had found the Mescalero camp, others might too. Wallace and his men could still be searching for them, and there was no telling how many others might have joined the hunt by now. Their path forward was clearer, but no less dangerous. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold as they prepared to depart. The promised horses, sturdy Apache ponies, small but strong and sure-footed, were saddled and loaded with supplies. Their guides, Nakoe and Tarak, were young men in their 20s, lean and watchful, with the easy confidence of those who knew the land intimately. Kianata came to see them off, offering a blessing in Apache that Aita translated quietly for Silas, a prayer for safe passage, for clear vision, for the strength to do what was right, rather than what was easy. As they rode out of camp, heading toward the distant mountains, Silas felt a strange sense of inevitability. Everything that had happened since he found Aita in the snow had led to this moment, this journey. Perhaps even everything before that, his time in the army, his presence at Raven Ridge, his years of solitary atonement in the cabin, all of it forming a path that had brought him here. They rode steadily through the morning, following game trails that wound through hills covered in juniper and piñon. Nakohe led with Aita close behind, then Silas with Tarak bringing up the rear. They spoke little, conserving energy and maintaining awareness of their surroundings. By midday, the terrain had begun to change, the gentle hills giving way to steeper slopes as they approached the foothills of the Sierra Blanca. They paused in the shade of a large pine to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of dried meat and corn cakes. "How far to the mountains?" Silas asked Nakohe. "We reach foothills by nightfall," the young guide replied. "Tomorrow enter mountains proper. Day after reach place, where you must go alone." Aita was studying the map fragments which she had spread on a flat rock. "This creek," she said, pointing to a wavy line on one of the pieces. "We follow to canyon entrance." Nakohe nodded. "Yes, creek leads to hidden canyon. Very narrow. Easy to miss, if not no signs." They continued their journey through the afternoon, climbing steadily higher as they approached the mountains. The air grew cooler, and the vegetation changed, more pine and fir, less juniper and cactus. By late afternoon, they had reached the first true foothills, rugged terrain that required careful navigation even for the sure-footed Apache ponies. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a protected hollow surrounded by massive boulders. A small spring provided fresh water, and the rocks offered natural shelter from the wind that had begun to rise as darkness fell. After a meal of rabbit stew prepared by Tarak, they gathered around the small fire to discuss the next day's journey. Nakohe used a stick to draw a rough map in the dirt showing the route they would follow into the mountains. "Here, valley between two ridges," he explained, pointing to a narrow passage in his drawing. "Follow to where three tall pines stand together. Turn east, there. Follow creek upstream." Silas committed the directions to memory, comparing them mentally with what he had seen on the map fragments. So far, everything aligned. The terrain features Nakohe described matched the symbols Aita had interpreted. "And the Silver River?" he asked. "How far beyond where you'll leave us?" Nakohe and Tarak exchanged a glance. "Half-day's journey," Tarak said, "through canyon that grows narrower and narrower. At end, cave entrance. Silver River inside mountain." Aita leaned forward, her expression intent. "Cave marked with symbols, guardians," Nakohe nodded. "Old paintings, very old. Show thunder beings, show eagle, show snake." He pointed to the tattoo visible on Aita's shoulder where her dress had slipped slightly. "Like your mark." She touched the tattoo reflexively, the eagle with a rattlesnake in its talons, symbol of her band. "My father says Silver River, guarded by these spirits, must approach with respect, with proper words." "You know these words?" Silas asked her. She nodded, though a shadow of doubt crossed her face. "I think so. Long time since I hear them, but I remember." They talked a while longer, discussing the terrain they would face, the potential dangers, both natural and human, that might lie ahead. Then, as the fire burned down to embers, they arranged watches for the night and settled into their bedrolls. Silas took the first watch, positioning himself on a boulder that offered a view of the approach to their camp. The night was clear, stars spreading across the black vault of the sky in countless thousands. In the distance, the dark mass of the Sierra Blanca loomed against the star field, mysterious and ancient. Somewhere in those mountains lay the Silver River, guarded by terrain and tradition for generations. Tomorrow, they would enter those mountains, and the day after they would venture alone into territory few outsiders had ever seen. And if they found what they sought, what then? Exposing the truth about Reed, about the plans to seize the sacred land for its silver that would require returning to civilization, facing the very authorities who now hunted them as criminals. It was a bridge they would cross when they came to it. Silas decided, first they had to find the Silver River, had to understand what made it so valuable that powerful men would kill to possess it. The night deepened around him, peaceful and vast. Below, Ayita slept near the dying fire, her face relaxed in slumber, her hand still near the knife at her belt. Even in sleep, part of her remained vigilant, ready. Silas watched over her over the camp, feeling a protectiveness that went beyond mere duty. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And somehow that made even the uncertainty ahead seem manageable. The next day dawned clear and cool, with a crispness to the air that spoke of the higher elevation they had reached. They broke camp efficiently, loading the horses and setting out as the first rays of sunlight touched the peaks above them. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they ventured deeper into the mountains. They followed narrow trails that wound through stands of pine and aspen, crossed swift-running streams swollen with snowmelt, and navigated rocky slopes that tested the skill of both riders and mounts. Nakohe and Tarak led with confidence, never hesitating at forks in the trail or difficult passages. They had clearly traveled this route before, though Silas suspected they had never taken outsiders this far into the sacred mountains. By midday, they had reached the valley Nakohe had described the night before, a narrow passage between two steep ridges with a clear stream running along its floor. They followed it for several miles, the valley gradually narrowing until the walls on either side seemed to press in around them. "There," Nakohe said, suddenly pointing ahead. "3 pines." Sure enough, at a bend in the valley stood 3 massive ponderosa pines, growing so close together they almost appeared as one at first glance. As they approached, Silas could see that the trees were ancient, their trunks scarred by lightning and centuries of weather, their branches spreading wide overhead. "From here, turn east," Nakohe instructed, guiding his pony up a narrow trail that branched away from the main valley. "Follow creek to its source." The new path was steeper, forcing them to dismount at times and lead the horses on foot. The creek beside them grew smaller as they climbed, eventually becoming a mere trickle among the rocks. By late afternoon, they reached a small plateau nestled between taller peaks. A spring bubbled up from the ground at its center, forming a clear pool before spilling over to become the creek they had followed. Around the plateau, a mixed forest of pine, aspen, and juniper provided shelter from the wind that blew steadily at this elevation. "We camp here tonight," Nakohe announced. "Tomorrow, we take you to place where you must go alone. Half-day's journey from here." They made camp near the spring, the horses secured, where they could graze on the plateau's sparse grass. As Tarak prepared a meal, Nakohe took Silas and Ayita aside, unfolding a piece of buckskin on which he had drawn a detailed map of the terrain ahead. "From here," he explained, "trail leads through forest, then up over ridge." His finger traced the route. "Down other side, enter canyon, very narrow. Follow to end. There, cave entrance." He tapped a specific point on the map, Silver River inside. Silas studied the map carefully, committing it to memory. "And the fourth piece of the map? What does it show that we're missing?" Nakohe shrugged. "Not sure. Never seen complete map. But elders say one piece shows how to pass guardians at cave entrance. Special signs, special words." Ayita leaned closer. "My father teach me some words," she said. "For passing guardians. Maybe enough." "Let us hope so," Nakohe replied. "Silver River, powerful place. Dangerous if approached wrong way." After eating, they spread their bedrolls and prepared for another night under the stars. The air was colder here than in the foothills, and they built the fire higher to ward off the chill. Silas noticed that both Nakohe and Tarak seemed more solemn this evening, less inclined to conversation. The proximity to sacred ground seemed to affect them deeply. As Silas took his turn at watch, he found his thoughts turning to what lay ahead. Tomorrow, they would reach the edge of the truly sacred territory, would venture alone into places few had seen. And if they found the Silver River, what then? What would they discover about its nature? About why men like Reed and whoever pulled his strings wanted it so desperately? The questions circled in his mind, unanswerable for now. But soon, perhaps they would have clarity, would understand the full scope of what they had stumbled into when he found Aita in that ceremonial circle, half dead in the snow. One way or another, their journey was nearing its culmination, and with it, perhaps answers to the questions that had driven them this far. The next morning brought a change in the weather. Clouds had gathered overnight, dark and heavy, with the promise of rain. A chill wind blew down from the higher peaks, carrying the scent of moisture and stone. "Storm coming," Nakohe observed as they prepared to depart. "Big one. May reach canyon before you." "Is it safe to continue?" Silas asked, eyeing the threatening sky. The young guide considered this. "Safe enough if careful, but water can fill canyon quickly if heavy rain. Must be aware." They set out under the lowering sky, following a trail that wound through dense forest, before beginning a steep ascent up the side of a ridge. The trail was narrow here, forcing them to proceed single file, the horses picking their way carefully over rocky ground. As they neared the top of the ridge, the wind intensified, bending the trees around them and sending dead leaves and pine needles swirling through the air. The clouds overhead had grown darker, and distant thunder rumbled among the peaks. "Hurry!" Tarak called from behind. "Storm coming fast!" They crested the ridge just as the first heavy drops began to fall. From this vantage point, they could see the terrain beyond a steep descent into a narrow canyon that twisted away between towering rock walls. The storm was moving rapidly across the mountains, sheets of rain visible in the distance advancing toward them. "There is your path," Nakohe said, pointing to the canyon. "Follow to end. Cave there where walls meet." Silas studied the route, noting how the canyon narrowed as it progressed until it appeared to vanish entirely in the distance. "How far to the cave?" 3, maybe 4 hours' walk," Nakohe replied, "depending on how fast move. Terrain difficult." The rain was falling more heavily now, driven sideways by the strengthening wind. Thunder boomed closer, echoing off the surrounding peaks. They needed to make a decision quickly. "We go now," Aita said, her voice firm despite the worsening conditions. "Before storm fills canyon." Silas nodded agreement. Waiting might mean losing their chance entirely if the canyon flooded. "Lead the way down," he told Nakohe. "We'll follow to where you must turn back." The descent into the canyon was treacherous, the trail slippery with rain and loose rock. They dismounted and led the horses, moving as quickly as safety allowed. By the time they reached the canyon floor, they were all soaked through the rain, now falling in a steady downpour. The canyon itself was a spectacular sight. Walls of red and ochre stone rising hundreds of feet on either side, carved by millennia of water and wind into fantastic shapes. The floor was relatively flat, though strewn with boulders and crossed by a small stream that was already beginning to rise with the rainfall. Nakohe led them a short distance into the canyon, then stopped at a place where the walls drew noticeably closer together. "This is where we leave you," he said. "Beyond is most sacred ground. Only those with proper knowledge may pass." He and Tarak helped unload supplies from the horses, enough food for several days, water containers, bedrolls, and other essentials. These were divided between packs for Silas and Aita to carry. "Follow canyon to end," Nakohe instructed again. "Watch for rising water. If stream becomes too high, seek higher ground." He pointed to ledges visible along the canyon walls. "They are shelves of rock. Climb if necessary." "How will we find you again?" Silas asked. "We wait here 3 days," Tarak said. "If not return by then, we go back to Camp Tel Kianata." It was a sobering reminder of the dangers they faced. 3 days to find the Silver River, learn what they could, and return. After that, they would be truly on their own. "Thank you," Silas said, clasping each guide's hand in turn, "for bringing us this far." Aita spoke to them in Apache words Silas couldn't understand, but that seemed to carry significant weight. Both young men nodded gravely in response. With final words of caution about the weather and terrain ahead, Nakohe and Tarak mounted their horses and began the ascent back up the ridge, leading Silas and Aita's mounts with them. Soon they were lost to sight in the rain and mist. Silas and Aita stood for a moment at the boundary of the sacred territory, the weight of their quest settling around them like the rain that soaked their clothes and skin. "Ready?" Silas asked. Aita nodded, adjusting the pack on her shoulders. "Ready." Together they turned and began the long walk into the heart of the canyon toward whatever secrets awaited at its end. The storm intensified as they proceeded, rain lashing down with renewed fury. Thunder crashed overhead, the sound amplified by the narrow canyon walls until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The stream beside them was rising steadily, its clear waters turning brown with soil washed down from above. They pushed on, and aware of the danger, but committed to their path. The canyon narrowed further as they progressed, the walls drawing closer on either side, until at times they could almost touch both simultaneously with outstretched arms. The floor became more uneven, with larger boulders requiring them to climb over or around. Despite the challenges, they made good progress. Aita moved with the sure-footedness of someone born to mountain terrain, and Silas's years as a scout had taught him how to navigate difficult country efficiently. After what felt like hours, they reached a point where the canyon made a sharp turn. As they rounded the bend, they came to an abrupt halt, faced with an unexpected sight. Before them, the canyon appeared to end in a sheer wall of rock. But at the base of the wall was an opening, a cave entrance, partially obscured by a cascade of water flowing over its upper edge. Around the entrance, faintly visible, even in the rain and dim light, were ancient paintings, figures of animals and spirits, rendered in red and black and white. "The Guardians," Aita whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain and running water. Silas stared at the cave entrance, understanding now why the fourth piece of the map might be crucial. The approach to the Silver River was hidden, disguised by the waterfall marked only by the ancient paintings that would be meaningless to anyone without the knowledge to interpret them. "Can you read the signs?" he asked. Aita stepped closer, studying the painted figures with intense concentration. "Some," she said. "Eagle, snake, thunder being." She pointed to each in turn. "Same as on map pieces. Same as stories my father told." The water in the canyon was rising more rapidly now, already ankle-deep where they stood. They needed to make a decision quickly. "Do you know how to pass?" Silas asked. "Without the fourth piece of the map." Aita was silent for a long moment, her eyes moving from one painted figure to another. Then she nodded slowly. "I think so. My father say guardians must be greeted with respect. With right words." She took a deep breath. "I remember words." She moved forward, approaching the cave entrance with measured steps. As she reached the edge of the waterfall, she began to speak not in English, but in Apache, her voice rising in a chant that seemed to weave through the sound of water and storm. Silas watched, fascinated, as she addressed each painted figure in turn, her hands moving in gestures that seemed both ancient and precise. There was power in her words, in her movements, a connection to something older than either of them, older perhaps than the mountains themselves. When she had completed her chant, she turned back to Silas. "Now we may enter," she said simply, "with respect, with open hearts." He joined her at the cave entrance. Together they stepped through the curtain of water and into the darkness beyond. The transition was abrupt from storm and noise to relative silence and stillness. The cave extended before them, a natural tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. It was not completely dark. A faint luminescence seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, providing just enough light to see by. They moved forward cautiously, the tunnel gradually descending. The air grew warmer as they progressed, and strangely still, as if the storm outside had no reach here. The only sound was the soft fall of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the tunnel roof. After walking for perhaps 100 yards, they began to hear something new, a soft rushing sound like distant water. It grew louder as they continued until it filled the tunnel with its gentle roar. Then suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern. They stopped at its edge, momentarily overwhelmed by what lay before them. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. But it was not the size that took their breath away, it was what filled it. Across the center of the cavern flowed a river unlike any they had ever seen. Its waters gleamed with an inner light, silvery white, casting reflections that danced across the stone walls. "The Silver River," Aita whispered, awe in her voice. Silas could only stare, transfixed by the unearthly beauty of it. The river moved with a strange fluidity, almost like quicksilver, yet clearly water. Its banks were lined with formations of crystal that caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns. They approached cautiously, stopping several feet from the river's edge. Now they could see that the silvery glow came from the river itself, or rather, from something within it. Beneath, the flowing water veins of pure native silver ran through the rock of the riverbed, so abundant they were visible even through the water's depth. "I've never seen anything like it," Silas said, his voice hushed in the presence of something so extraordinary. "The silver, it's not in ore. It's pure." "Earth's blood," Aita said, echoing what she had told him before. "Most sacred metal, most powerful." Silas knelt at the river's edge, careful not to touch the water. The silver veins beneath the surface were incredibly rich, not just traces or thin seams, but massive deposits, as if the entire riverbed were laced with the precious metal. "This is why they want it," he said, understanding dawning. "Not just for its value, but for its purity. Silver this pure, this abundant, it would be worth a fortune. And if it has special properties—" "It does," Aita confirmed. "My father says silver from this river has power, healing power, protection power. In right hand, great medicine. In wrong hands," she shook her head, "great danger." Silas stood, his mind racing. The implications were staggering. If what Aita said was true, if the silver really did possess unusual properties, it would be invaluable not just to jewelers or the treasury, but to the military, to industry, to medicine. No wonder someone in Washington was willing to kill for it, to erase entire Apache bands to possess it. "We need to document this," he said. "Find a way to prove what's here, why it's sacred. Something we can take back, show to people who might help protect it." Aita nodded. From her pack she withdrew a small leather pouch. "For proof," she explained. "Not silver itself cannot take that, but water from river, stone from bank, things allowed to leave if taken with respect." Following her lead, Silas helped collect samples, a small vial of the silvery water, several stones from the riverbank, each bearing traces of the pure silver. These they wrapped carefully and stowed in their packs. As they worked, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something far more significant than they had realized. Not just a sacred site to be protected, but a natural wonder, a scientific anomaly. Something that, in the wrong hands, could indeed be dangerous, but that properly understood and respected might offer great benefits. "What now?" Aita asked when they had finished collecting their evidence. "How we stop them from taking this place?" It was the question that had been forming in Silas's mind as well. Now that they had found the Silver River, now that they understood its nature, how could they possibly protect it from the forces aligned against it? "We need to get this information to people who can help," he said, slowly thinking it through. "Not just the army or the government, they're part of the problem. But there are others. Newspapers in the East. Scientists who would understand the importance of studying this properly, not just exploiting it. People in Congress who advocate for Indian rights." "How we reach them?" Aita asked. "We are hunted. Wanted." It was a valid concern. With warrants out for their arrest, with Reed's death still hanging over them, they couldn't simply walk into a newspaper office or approach a congressman. "Mackenzie," Silas said after a moment. "He has connections, and he believed in what we're doing." He thought further. "And Wallace, my old lieutenant. He seemed confused about the silver. Maybe he doesn't know the full story of what Reed was doing. If we could get to him, show him the truth." Aita looked skeptical. "Trust soldier who hunt us, not trust," Silas clarified. "Use. Wallace has a conscience. I saw it at Raven Ridge. If he understood what was really happening, that Reed was working for someone with designs on this place, he might help. Or at least, he might listen long enough for us to get the evidence to someone who can use it." They continued discussing possibilities as they prepared to leave the cavern. The storm outside had likely passed by now, and they needed to begin the journey back through the canyon if they hoped to meet Nakohei and Tarak at the appointed time. As they made their way back through the luminescent tunnel, Silas felt a renewed sense of purpose. What they had discovered was worth protecting not just for the Apache people, but for everyone. The Silver River was a natural wonder, a scientific marvel, a sacred site. It deserved study, respect, preservation, not exploitation, not destruction in the name of profit or power. They would find a way to tell its story, to expose the forces that sought to control it. And in doing so, perhaps they would find justice for Aita's people, for the victims of Raven Ridge, for themselves. The path ahead was still fraught with danger. But for the first time since their journey began, Silas felt they had a chance, not just to survive, but to succeed, to make a difference. Together, they stepped back through the waterfall and into the canyon beyond, carrying with them the evidence that might just change everything.